Welcome, weary travelers, to the gentle realm where Hawkins' hidden histories unfold like whispered bedtime stories. Tonight we journey through the quiet corridors of memory, exploring the backstories that shaped every soul in our beloved small town. From the earliest days of government experiments to the childhood dreams that would later face supernatural nightmares, we'll trace the delicate threads that connect each character's past to their heroic present. So settle into your most comfortable sanctuary. Let the soft glow of nostalgia wash over you and allow these origin stories to carry you into peaceful slumber as we discover the beautiful beginnings behind every familiar face. The photograph that Victor Creel keeps hidden in his dresser drawer shows a family that once believed in tomorrow with the innocent faith that characterizes all happy beginnings. Taken in the spring of 1954, the image captures a moment of pure domestic bliss outside their newly purchased home on Maple Street in Hawkins, Indiana, a white colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch that promised everything the American dream could offer to a young family seeking their place in the world. Victor stands tall in his pressed work clothes, his arm wrapped protectively around his wife Virginia, whose radiant smile speaks of contentment found in simple pleasures and shared hopes. Beside them, 10-year-old Henry gazes at the camera with the thoughtful expression that would later be misunderstood as something darker, but in this moment represents nothing more than the artistic sensitivity of a child who sees the world through different eyes. Little Alice, barely 8, clutches a rag doll that she has named Priscilla after the fairy princess in her favorite bedtime story, her pigtails catching the afternoon sunlight that seems to bless this ordinary moment with extraordinary warmth. The house behind them stands as monument to their collective aspirations, freshly painted, lovingly maintained, surrounded by flower beds that Virginia tends with the same devotion she brings to nurturing her children. The mortgage papers tucked away in Victor's desk drawer represent not financial burden but investment in a future where his children will grow up surrounded by stability and love, where bedtime stories will always have happy endings and monsters exist only in the realm of imagination. Victor's own childhood in rural Ohio had been marked by the kind of poverty that teaches children to appreciate small comforts and dream of providing better for their own families. The son of a factory worker and a seamstress, he learned early that security comes through honest work and careful planning, that dreams become reality through patient dedication rather than grand gestures. His courtship of Virginia unfolded with the gentle persistence of someone who understood that the most precious things in life require time to develop properly. Virginia Creel brought to their marriage the warmth of a woman who had been raised by parents who believed that home should be a sanctuary where love expresses itself through countless small acts of care and attention. Her own mother had taught her that the secret to happiness lay not in grand adventures but in the daily ritual of making life beautiful for those she loved most. The way she arranged flowers in mason jars, the songs she hummed while preparing dinner, the stories she invented to help her children fall asleep. These became the foundation stones upon which the Creel household built its identity. The move to Hawkins represented a new chapter for the family. Victor's promotion at the regional office providing the financial stability necessary to purchase their dream home, while Virginia looked forward to establishing roots in a community small enough that neighbors would know each other's names and children could play safely in tree-lined streets. The town's reputation for wholesome family values and excellent schools made it seem like the perfect place to raise Henry and Alice during the formative years when their personalities would be shaped by the world around them. Young Henry Creel possessed the kind of sensitivity that marked him as different from other children, but not in ways that anyone could have predicted would lead to tragedy. His fascination with drawing stemmed from an artist's eye that found beauty in unexpected places. The way shadows fell across the kitchen floor during afternoon storms, the intricate patterns that frost created on winter windows, the delicate architecture of spiderwebs heavy with morning dew. His sketchbooks filled with images that revealed a child's wonder at the complexity of the natural world. His teachers noted his exceptional creativity, but also his tendency towards solitude, the way he preferred quiet observation to the boisterous games that occupied his classmates during recess. This introversion worried Victor and Virginia, only in the way that all parents worry when their child seems different from their peers. But they encouraged his artistic pursuits while gently nudging him towards social activities that might help him develop friendships with children his own age. The basement of the Maple Street house became Henry's sanctuary, a place where he could spread his drawings across the concrete floor and lose himself in creative projects that transported him far beyond the boundaries of small-town Indiana. Virginia would find him there for hours, surrounded by sketches and colored pencils, working with the focused intensity of someone much older than his actual years. She never disturbed these moments of artistic absorption, recognizing instinctively that creativity required solitude and space to flourish. Alice represented the other side of childhood, the extroverted energy that complemented her brother's introspective nature. Where Henry found magic in shadows and silence, Alice discovered it in constant motion and enthusiastic interaction with everyone around her. Her laughter filled the house during those golden early years, her endless questions and observations providing soundtrack to the family's daily routines. She approached life with the fearless curiosity that characterizes children who have never encountered anything truly frightening. The siblings' relationship during these innocent years reflected the natural bond that develops between children who grow up feeling secure in their parents' love and protection. Henry's protective instincts toward his younger sister manifested in gentle guidance rather than domination, while Alice's admiration for her artistic older brother expressed itself through attempts to imitate his drawings and stories. Their bedtime conversations, whispered across the narrow space between their beds, wove together dreams and plans that seemed entirely achievable in a world where good parents and comfortable homes provided all the security that young hearts required. Virginia's daily routine during those early Hawkins years established the rhythms that would define the family's sense of normalcy. Morning coffee shared with Victor before he left for work, breakfast conversations with the children about their plans for the day, afternoons spent tending her garden while Alice played nearby, and Henry worked on his latest artistic project. The dinner table became the heart of family communication, where each member shared the day's experiences, while Virginia's carefully prepared meals provided nourishment for both body and soul. The neighborhood welcomed the Creels with the genuine warmth that characterized small Midwestern communities in the 1950s, when social conventions encouraged neighbors to look out for each other, and children were considered everyone's shared responsibility. Virginia quickly developed friendships with other mothers on Maple Street, relationships built around shared concerns about schools and weather, recipes exchanged across backyard fences, and the comfortable camaraderie of women whose lives revolved around creating comfortable homes for their families. Victor's integration into Hawkins' professional community proceeded with similar ease, his steady work ethic and quiet competence earning respect among colleagues who appreciated reliability over flashiness. He joined the volunteer fire department and participated in community events with the dutiful civic spirit of someone who understood that small towns function through collective participation. These connections provided the family with social roots that seemed to promise lifelong stability. Sunday services at Hawkins Community Church represented another anchor point in the family's weekly routine, the familiar hymns and gentle sermons providing spiritual framework for lives organized around gratitude and service to others. Henry's artistic eye appreciated the colored light streaming through stained glass windows, while Alice fidgeted through services that tested her young attention span. Victor and Virginia found in these weekly gatherings confirmation that they had chosen wisely in making Hawkins their permanent home. The seasonal rhythms that governed small-town life provided natural markers for the family's growing sense of belonging. Spring brought gardening projects and Easter egg hunts. Summer delivered long evenings on the front porch with neighbors stopping by for conversation. Autumn arrived with harvest festivals and the excitement of new school years, while winter created cozy indoor spaces where the family gathered around the radio for evening programs that transported them to worlds beyond their comfortable reality. The local school that Henry and Alice attended reflected Hawkins' commitment to providing children with education that balanced academic achievement with character development. Henry's teachers recognized his artistic gifts while working gently to help him develop social connections that might ease his natural tendency toward isolation. Alice thrived in the structured environment that rewarded her natural enthusiasm and curiosity. Her report cards filled with comments about her helpful nature and positive influence on classroom dynamics. The gradual changes that would later prove significant began so subtly that no one in the family recognized them as warning signs of approaching darkness. Henry's artistic subjects shifted from nature studies to more abstract compositions, his fascination with patterns and symmetries taking on qualities that suggested influences beyond simple childhood imagination. His increasing preference for solitude began to feel less like natural introversion and more like deliberate withdrawal from family activities that had previously brought him joy. The house itself seemed to develop personality quirks during those final months of normalcy, creaking floorboards that had never made noise before, electrical fluctuations that caused lights to flicker at odd moments, temperature variations that left certain rooms uncomfortably cold, despite adequate heating. Virginia attributed these phenomena to the settling patterns natural in older homes, while Victor made mental notes about maintenance projects that would need attention when weather permitted. Alice's sleep began to suffer from nightmares that she could never quite remember upon waking, leaving her tired and cranky during days that had previously been filled with boundless energy. Virginia tried various remedies, different bedtimes, warmer milk, extra bedtime stories, but nothing seemed to restore her daughter's natural sleep patterns. The family doctor suggested growing pains and adolescent development, explanations that seemed reasonable to parents who had no context for understanding supernatural influence. The photograph in Victor's dresser drawer preserves this family in their final moment of complete happiness, before the shadow that would destroy everything they had built together made its presence known in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. In that captured instant, they remained forever frozen in sunlight and innocence, their smiles reflecting absolute faith in tomorrow's promise to bring more of the same joy and security they had worked so hard to create. The dreams that filled their sleep during those last nights of peace carried visions of Christmas mornings yet to come, birthday celebrations that would mark their children's continued growth, anniversaries that would deepen their marriage bonds, and all the ordinary miracles that constitute a life well lived in service to love and family. None of them could have imagined that forces beyond human understanding were already weaving their way through the foundation of everything they held dear, preparing to transform their sanctuary into a theater for horrors that would echo through generations of Hawkins history. The young boy who would grow into Jim Hopper spent his earliest years believing that heroism was something that lived in comic books and Saturday matinee serials, never imagining that real life would demand from him the kind of courage that transforms ordinary men into legends whispered around kitchen tables for generations to come. Born in 1942 to a father who worked the steel mills and a mother who kept house with the fierce pride that characterized women of her generation, Jimmy Hopper learned his first lessons about strength and sacrifice from parents who understood that security came through honest labor and unwavering commitment to family. The Hawkins of Hopper's childhood existed as a different world entirely from the town that would later become synonymous with supernatural crisis. Its tree-lined streets, filled with the sounds of children playing games that required nothing more sophisticated than imagination and the willingness to believe that backyard adventures could rival anything Hollywood might devise. The Hopper household occupied a modest frame house on Cherry Street, its small rooms made spacious by the love that filled every corner and the laughter that echoed from the kitchen where his mother prepared meals that somehow stretched meager budgets into feasts that satisfied both hunger and soul. James Hopper Sr. carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who measured success not in dollars accumulated, but in promises kept and responsibilities honored, his calloused hands telling the story of decades spent coaxing productivity from machinery that served the greater good of American industry during the years when such work felt like participation in something larger than individual survival. He taught his son that strength was not demonstrated through violence or aggression, but through the steady reliability that allowed other people to build their own dreams on the foundation of your trustworthiness. The lessons began early in the workshop behind their house, where father and son spent weekend mornings learning that tools were extensions of will and that every project undertaken was an opportunity to practice the patience and precision that would serve a man throughout his life regardless of what profession he ultimately chose. Young Jimmy's fascination with taking things apart to understand how they worked reflected the same curiosity that would later make him an effective investigator. Though in those innocent days, the mysteries he solved involved broken radios and stubborn lawnmowers, rather than missing children and government conspiracies. His mother's influence manifested differently, but with equal importance in shaping the compassion that would define Hopper's approach to law enforcement decades later. Margaret Hopper possessed the gift of making every person who entered their home feel welcomed and valued. Her ability to listen without judgment, creating a sanctuary where neighbors brought their troubles and children sought comfort when their own homes failed to provide the security that growing hearts required. Jimmy learned from watching her that strength could be gentle and that the most powerful force in human experience was the willingness to care about other people's welfare, even when such caring brought no tangible reward. The friendship that developed between young Jimmy and Joyce Maldonado during their elementary school years grew from the natural affinity that draws together children who share similar values, despite coming from different economic circumstances. While the Hoppers struggled to make ends meet on a factory worker's wages, the Maldonados faced even greater financial challenges. Yet both families prioritized education and character development over material possessions, creating common ground where genuine friendship could flourish without the complications that economic disparity might otherwise introduce. Their shared love of adventure novels and Saturday afternoon serials created a bond that transcended the social hierarchies that governed most childhood relationships. Joyce's quick wit and fearless spirit, complementing Jimmy's more methodical approach to problem solving in ways that made them natural partners for the kind of innocent investigations that small-town children pursue during summers that stretch like eternities filled with possibility and discovery. Their exploration of Hawkins Creek beds and abandoned buildings was driven by genuine curiosity about the world around them, rather than any desire to seek trouble or challenge adult authority. The high school years that followed brought new dimensions to their relationship as adolescent emotions complicated the easy camaraderie they had enjoyed throughout childhood. Jimmy's growing awareness of Joyce as someone whose friendship might evolve into something deeper, creating the kind of nervous energy that characterizes first love in all its awkward beauty. The school dances, where they learned to navigate the complex choreography of teenage romance, provided a backdrop for conversations that revealed dreams and fears previously kept private, their mutual trust deepening into the kind of emotional intimacy that would sustain them through the challenges that lay ahead. Joyce's involvement in the drama department introduced Jimmy to aspects of artistic expression that his practical upbringing had never emphasized. Her passion for storytelling and performance, opening his eyes to the power of imagination to illuminate truths that more direct forms of communication might fail to convey. The hours he spent watching her rehearse various roles taught him that people were more complex than their surface appearances suggested, and that understanding human behavior required the kind of empathy that could see past immediate circumstances to the deeper motivations that drove individual choices. The gradual awareness that his feelings for Joyce ran deeper than simple friendship created both joy and anxiety for a young man who had been raised to believe that commitment was a sacred responsibility not to be undertaken lightly or without careful consideration of one's ability to honor the promises that love demanded. The letters they exchanged during the summer of 1959, when family circumstances separated them for 2 months, revealed the depth of affection they had developed, their correspondence filled with observations about daily life that took on significance only because they were shared with someone who truly understood their importance. The decision to enlist in the military following high school graduation arose from Jimmy's understanding that young men of his generation had obligations to serve their country during times when global tensions threatened the peaceful existence that previous generations had fought to establish, his sense of duty overriding the natural reluctance to leave behind everything familiar and comfortable for the uncertainties that awaited in training camps and foreign battlefields. The tearful goodbye he shared with Joyce at the Hawkins bus depot carried the weight of promises that neither could be certain they would have the opportunity to fulfill. Boot camp and advanced training transformed the thoughtful teenager into a soldier capable of functioning under pressure that would have overwhelmed his civilian self. The military's systematic approach to building warriors out of ordinary young men revealing reserves of strength and determination that Jimmy had never suspected he possessed. The friendships forged in the crucible of shared hardship created bonds that would endure long after uniforms were stored away and medals were relegated to dresser drawers, his fellow soldiers becoming the brothers he had never had growing up as an only child. The deployment to Vietnam introduced Jimmy to forms of complexity and moral ambiguity that no amount of small-town upbringing could have prepared him to navigate. The brutal realities of warfare, challenging every assumption he had made about heroism and justice, while simultaneously revealing the depths of courage and sacrifice that ordinary people could demonstrate when circumstances demanded nothing less than complete commitment to protecting their comrades. The jungle combat that claimed so many of his friends taught him that survival often depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information, lessons that would prove invaluable during his later career in law enforcement. The letters that continued to arrive from Joyce throughout his military service provided lifelines to the world he had left behind and hoped to return to when his obligations were fulfilled. Her accounts of daily life in Hawkins, serving as reminders of why the sacrifices required by military service were worthwhile investments in preserving the kind of community where children could grow up, believing that tomorrow would always offer more opportunities than yesterday. The photograph of her that he carried in his wallet became a talisman against the despair that threatened to overwhelm soldiers who witnessed too much death and destruction in service of causes they were not always certain they fully understood. The return to civilian life following his discharge brought challenges that no one had warned him to expect. The transition from military structure to the freedom of personal choice proving more difficult than the adjustment to military discipline had been years earlier. The Hawkins he found upon his return seemed smaller and more fragile than the town preserved in his memory. Its innocent concerns about local politics and high school football seeming almost trivial after years spent dealing with matters of life and death on a daily basis. The reunion with Joyce carried both joy and awkwardness, as both discovered that the young people who had fallen in love before the war had been changed by experiences that were difficult to communicate to someone who had not shared them, their efforts to recapture the easy intimacy they had once enjoyed, complicated by the knowledge that both had grown in directions that might no longer be compatible with their original dreams of shared future. The conversations that followed were filled with careful exploration of whether love could survive the kind of transformation that war and separation inevitably create in people's fundamental understanding of themselves and the world around them. The job opportunities available to returning veterans in Hawkins included positions that seemed to offer security but little satisfaction for someone whose military experience had revealed leadership capabilities that civilian employment rarely required. Jimmy's restlessness during his first months back home reflecting the difficulty of finding purpose in peacetime pursuits. After years of service, where every action carried consequences measured in human lives, the police department's offer of a position as a junior officer provided the combination of public service and ongoing challenge that appealed to his desire to continue making a difference in other people's lives. The courtship and marriage to Diane that followed represented Jimmy's attempt to build the kind of stable family life that military service had taught him to value above all other achievements. Her gentle nature and shared commitment to creating a peaceful home, providing the foundation for dreams that seemed finally within reach after years of uncertainty and separation. Their small apartment filled with second-hand furniture, purchased with careful attention to their limited budget, became a sanctuary where the future could be planned with the confidence that came from knowing they faced its challenges together. The birth of Sarah transformed Jimmy from a man who understood duty in abstract terms into a father who experienced the fierce, protective instincts that gave personal meaning to every sacrifice he had made in service of creating a world safe enough for innocent children to grow up believing in goodness and possibility. The first time he held his daughter, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb with surprising strength, he understood finally why his own father had worked so hard to provide security for his family, and why such work had never felt like burden but rather like privilege. The years that followed Sarah's arrival were marked by the kind of quiet happiness that constitutes true success in life. Their modest home, filled with laughter, and the countless small celebrations that mark a child's development from helpless infant to curious toddler to imaginative preschooler, whose questions about the world revealed the wonder that adults often lose in their preoccupation with practical concerns. Jimmy's police work provided enough challenge and variety to keep him engaged, while allowing him to return home each evening to family routines that anchored his identity in something larger and more important than professional achievement. The cancer diagnosis that shattered this carefully constructed piece arrived without warning or explanation. The doctor's words falling into their conversation like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of disruption that would continue spreading long after the initial impact had passed. The medical terminology that suddenly filled their daily vocabulary represented a foreign language that had to be learned quickly and thoroughly if they were to have any hope of navigating the treatment protocols that offered their only chance of preserving the life they had built around their daughter's presence. The hospital visits that consumed their days and nights during Sarah's illness tested every resource of strength and faith that Jimmy and Diane possessed. The sterile corridors and beeping machines, creating an environment where hope had to be carefully cultivated. and protected against the evidence of suffering that surrounded them at every turn. The other families they met during those long months of treatment became part of an unwanted community united by shared fear and desperate love, their mutual support providing lifelines that helped everyone involved maintain the determination necessary to continue fighting against odds that seemed increasingly insurmountable. Sarah's courage throughout her illness taught her parents lessons about dignity and grace under pressure that no military training or professional experience could have provided. Her ability to find joy in small pleasures, despite the pain and exhaustion that marked her daily existence, demonstrating reserves of strength that humbled adults who had considered themselves battle-tested by lesser challenges. The stories she insisted on hearing each night, the drawings she created between treatments, the way she comforted other sick children despite her own suffering, these became treasured memories that would sustain Jimmy through the darkness that followed her death. The morning when the monitors fell silent and the medical team stepped back with expressions of defeat and sympathy marked the end of everything that had given Jimmy's life meaning and purpose. The loss so profound that it seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself, leaving him stranded in a world where the future had been amputated and the present offered nothing but reminders of what had been lost forever. The funeral service that followed became a blur of faces and voices, offering condolences that meant well, but could not begin to address the magnitude of the emptiness that now defined his existence. The divorce from Diane that followed Sarah's death reflected not failure of love, but the inability of two broken people to help each other heal when their individual grief processes moved in directions that made shared recovery impossible. Their mutual understanding that separation represented mercy rather than abandonment, allowing them to part with respect intact, even as their marriage became another casualty of the tragedy that had consumed their daughter. The division of possessions that had once represented their shared life became an exercise in distributing artifacts from an existence that no longer had any relevance to who they had become. The return to Hawkins represented Jimmy's attempt to find some form of peace in the landscape of his childhood, the familiar streets and buildings offering the possibility that proximity to happier memories might eventually provide foundation for rebuilding some version of meaningful existence from the ruins of everything he had lost. The position as chief of police came with responsibilities that seemed manageable compared to the cosmic injustices he had already survived, the town's problems appearing refreshingly simple after years spent fighting battles against enemies that could not be arrested or reasoned with. The cabin in the woods where he chose to live reflected his need for solitude and simplicity after years of hospitals and funeral homes and lawyers' offices, the isolation providing space where grief could be experienced without the social obligations that well-meaning friends and colleagues inevitably imposed on someone whose loss was too large for normal conversation to address adequately. The alcohol that became his primary companion during those first years back in Hawkins served as anesthetic against pain that seemed beyond the reach of more conventional forms of healing. The gradual discovery that police work in Hawkins involved mostly routine matters of public safety rather than the life and death crises he had grown accustomed to handling came as relief to someone whose reserves of emergency response had been depleted by personal tragedy. The predictable nature of small-town law enforcement allowing him to function professionally even while his personal life remained frozen in the amber of unprocessed grief. The respect he earned from citizens who appreciated his steady competence provided some measure of purpose even when nothing else seemed to matter. The November evening when Joyce Byers burst into his office with wild stories about her missing son triggered something in Jimmy that had been dormant since Sarah's death. Her desperate certainty that Will was in genuine danger, resonating with protective instincts that had been numbed by years of alcohol and emotional withdrawal. The investigation that followed would prove that the capacity for heroism had survived intact beneath layers of accumulated pain, waiting for circumstances that demanded its return to active duty in service of saving other people's children when he had been unable to save his own. The girl who would become Joyce Byers entered the world as Joyce Maldonado in 1945, born into a household where laughter served as currency more valuable than the dollars that always seemed too scarce to cover all the necessities that growing families require. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Maldonado, had arrived in Hawkins during the war years when industrial jobs drew families from across the Midwest to communities that promised steady work and the possibility of building something lasting for children who deserved better, opportunities than their parents had known, growing up in places where dreams were luxuries that practical people could rarely afford. The small house on Elm Street where Joyce spent her formative years contained more love than square footage, its cramped rooms made spacious by the warmth that filled every corner and the music that drifted from the kitchen radio during evening hours, when the family gathered around a table that had been constructed by Carlos himself from lumber, purchased with overtime wages earned through extra shifts at the plant. Maria's voice, raised in songs remembered from her own childhood, provided soundtrack to domestic routines that transformed ordinary moments into celebrations of connection and gratitude. Joyce's earliest memories were painted in the vibrant colors of a mother who refused to allow financial limitations to diminish the richness of experiences she provided for her children. Maria's creativity expressing itself through elaborate games invented from household objects and stories spun from imagination rather than purchased from stores that remained beyond their economic reach. The cardboard boxes that became castles, the kitchen chairs that transformed into fortresses, the blankets that created magical kingdoms. These improvised toys taught Joyce that happiness could be manufactured from nothing more substantial than love and willingness to see wonder in ordinary circumstances. The elementary school that Joyce attended reflected Hawkins' commitment to providing all children with education that transcended economic circumstances, its dedicated teachers recognizing that intelligence and creativity flourished equally among students, regardless of the size of their families' bank accounts or the fashionability of their clothing. Joyce's natural brightness made her a favorite among faculty members, who understood that encouragement offered to eager young minds represented investments that would pay dividends throughout entire lifetimes of achievement and contribution. Her friendship with Jimmy Hopper developed during those innocent years when social hierarchies mattered less than shared interests and compatible personalities, their bond strengthened by complementary natures that allowed each to provide what the other needed most. Joyce's enthusiastic optimism, balancing Jimmy's more cautious approach to new experiences, while his steady reliability gave her the security necessary to pursue adventures that might otherwise seem too risky for a girl whose family could not afford the consequences of serious mistakes. The after-school hours they spent exploring Hawkins' neighborhoods and surrounding countryside created a treasure trove of shared memories that would sustain them both through the challenges that adolescence and adulthood would inevitably bring. Their innocent investigations of abandoned buildings and hidden creek beds, providing training in cooperation and problem-solving that served as foundation for the deeper partnership that gradually developed between them as childhood. Friendship matured into something more complex and significant. Joyce's involvement in the high school drama department opened doorways to forms of expression that her practical upbringing had never emphasized. The theater providing a sanctuary where emotions could be explored safely and imagination could be celebrated rather than dismissed as impractical indulgence, unsuitable for young people who needed to focus on preparing for adult responsibilities that would require more concrete skills than the ability to pretend convincingly. The roles she played on Hawkins High's small stage ranged from comic relief characters, whose humor masked deeper truths about human nature, to dramatic leads whose emotional journeys demanded access to feelings that Joyce was only beginning to understand in her own life. Each performance teaching her something new about the complexity of human experience and the power of storytelling to illuminate aspects of existence that ordinary conversation might fail to address adequately. Her relationship with Jimmy during these formative years carried the sweetness that characterizes first love when it develops between people who have known and trusted each other long enough that romantic feelings seem like natural evolution rather than dramatic disruption of established patterns. Their courtship unfolded with the gentle pace that small-town life encouraged, each milestone celebrated within the context of community that took proprietary interest in young couples whose happiness reflected well on the values and stability that defined Hawkins as a place where traditional morality still governed social interactions. The letters they exchanged during temporary separations caused by family obligations or summer employment revealed depths of affection and understanding that might have remained hidden in relationships based solely on physical proximity. Their written conversations, creating intimacy that transcended the limitations of face-to-face meetings, constrained by parental supervision and social expectations that governed teenage romance in communities where reputation was currency that could not be squandered carelessly. The plans they made for their shared future reflected the optimism that characterized young people who had grown up believing that hard work and moral behavior would be rewarded with opportunities to build lives that improved upon their parents' achievements, their dreams modest by urban standards but appropriate for people whose values prioritized family and community over individual ambition or material accumulation that might require sacrificing relationships for professional advancement. The decision that took Jimmy away to military service marked Joyce's first encounter with the reality that love could not always overcome circumstances beyond individual control. Their tearful goodbye at the bus station teaching her lessons about strength and patience that her sheltered childhood had never required her to develop. The promise to wait for his return represented commitment that would be tested by time and distance in ways that 17-year-old hearts could not fully comprehend, despite their absolute certainty about the permanence of their feelings. The job at Melvald's general store that occupied Joyce's time during Jimmy's absence provided more than simple employment. It offered education in human nature that no classroom could have provided. Her daily interactions with customers revealing the hidden struggles and secret joys that existed behind the facades that people presented to protect their privacy in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The position also introduced her to Lonnie Byers, whose easy charm and apparent confidence seemed to offer the kind of immediate gratification that could distract from the loneliness that Jimmy's absence created. Lonnie's pursuit of Joyce combined persistence with the kind of romantic gestures that seemed designed specifically to appeal to someone whose boyfriend was thousands of miles away fighting a war that dominated newspaper headlines, but felt abstract and distant to people whose daily concerns involved more immediate matters of work and family and community obligations. His motorcycle rides along country roads, impromptu picnics beside Lovers' Lake, and promises of adventures that extended beyond Hawkins' boundaries created a fantasy of spontaneous romance that contrasted sharply with the patient commitment that characterized her relationship with Jimmy. The internal conflict that Joyce experienced as Lonnie's attentions intensified reflected the natural confusion that accompanies situations where heart and mind provide contradictory guidance, her loyalty to Jimmy competing with the very real loneliness that his absence created, and the equally real attraction she felt towards someone whose presence offered immediate comfort rather than the delayed gratification that came with waiting for promises that might not be kept by young men whose return from war could never be guaranteed. The decision to marry Lonnie following news that Jimmy had been wounded in Vietnam and might not return for months or years represented Joyce's attempt to choose certainty over uncertainty, security over risk, immediate happiness over the possibility that patience might ultimately prove to have been wasted on hopes that circumstances beyond anyone's control could easily destroy. The wedding ceremony at Hawkins Community Church was modest but joyful, attended by family and friends who wished the couple well, despite private reservations about the haste with which their courtship had proceeded to permanent commitment. The early months of marriage to Lonnie carried the excitement that comes with establishing independent households and learning to navigate the compromises that shared living requires. Their small apartment filled with second-hand furniture and wedding gifts that represented community investment in their success as partners building life together. Lonnie's job at the auto repair shop provided steady income while Joyce continued working at Melvald's. Their combined wages sufficient to cover basic necessities while allowing for occasional luxuries that made them feel prosperous despite their actually modest circumstances. The pregnancy that resulted in Jonathan's birth brought joy that was complicated by the financial pressures that additional family members inevitably create. Lonnie's initial enthusiasm for fatherhood giving way to anxiety about responsibilities that seemed larger and more permanent than he had anticipated when marriage and parenthood existed only as abstract concepts rather than daily realities requiring constant attention and sacrifice. Joyce's transition from wife to mother proceeded more smoothly, her natural nurturing instincts finding full expression in the care she provided for their son. Jonathan's infancy revealed aspects of both parents' characters that their courtship had not fully disclosed, Joyce's patience and devotion contrasting sharply with Lonnie's restlessness and his increasing tendency to seek entertainment outside their home when childcare responsibilities began to feel more like burden than privilege. The sleepless nights and endless demands of infant care tested their relationship in ways that romantic fantasy had never prepared them to anticipate, revealing fundamental differences in their understanding of what family commitment actually required. The birth of Will, 4 years later, occurred during a period when Lonnie's dissatisfaction with domestic life had already begun manifesting in behaviors that suggested his vision of himself did not include the kind of steady responsibility that raising children demanded from fathers who took their obligations seriously. Joyce's joy at welcoming their second son was tempered by growing awareness that she might be facing the challenges of motherhood without the partner support she had expected to receive from the man whose children she was raising. The gradual deterioration of her marriage to Lonnie unfolded with the slow inevitability that characterizes relationships where fundamental incompatibilities become apparent only after legal and emotional commitments have made separation painful and complicated. His increasing absences from home, explained by work obligations that seemed to require more evening and weekend hours than similar positions demanded from other men, created patterns of single parenthood that Joyce learned to manage while maintaining hope that their relationship might still be salvaged through patience and understanding. The financial struggles that marked their later years together reflected both Lonnie's inconsistent work habits and his tendency to prioritize personal pleasures over family necessities. Joyce's careful budgeting and resourceful household management becoming essential skills as she learned to stretch inadequate resources to cover basic requirements while protecting their children from awareness that their family's economic situation was becoming increasingly precarious due to their father's unreliability. The divorce that finally ended their marriage came as relief rather than tragedy. Joyce's decision to seek legal separation, representing acceptance that some problems could not be solved through additional effort or greater sacrifice on her part. The custody arrangements that followed reflected Lonnie's half-hearted interest in maintaining relationships with children whose needs had consistently taken second place to his own desires for freedom from the responsibilities that parenthood and marriage had imposed upon his previously unencumbered existence. The single motherhood that followed divorce brought challenges that were balanced by the discovery that Joyce possessed reserves of strength and capability that married life had never required her to develop fully. Her natural resilience, finding expression in the creative solutions she devised for problems that traditional two-parent households might have addressed through division of labor rather than individual resourcefulness and determination. The jobs she worked to support Jonathan and Will ranged from retail positions to cleaning services to seasonal employment that required her to be away from home during hours when other mothers might be helping with homework or preparing family dinners. Her schedule demanding organizational skills that transformed every day into exercises in logistics and priority management. The exhaustion that became her constant companion was offset by pride in her ability to provide for her children without assistance from their father or charity from community members who might have offered help that came with conditions or expectations that compromised her independence. The relationship she developed with her sons during these years of economic hardship and social isolation reflected the intensified bonds that often emerge between family members who must depend entirely upon each other for emotional support and practical assistance, their shared struggles creating loyalty and understanding that more comfortable circumstances might not have fostered as effectively. The conversations around their dinner table, the bedtime stories that cost nothing but time and imagination, the weekend adventures that explored free entertainment options, these became treasured traditions that would define their family identity long after financial circumstances improved. Jonathan's evolution from child to junior partner in household management demonstrated his understanding that their family's survival required contributions from every member, regardless of age. His willingness to assume responsibilities that other teenagers might have resented, reflecting both his natural maturity and his recognition that his mother needed support that no one else was willing or able to provide consistently. Will's more sensitive nature required different forms of protection and encouragement. Joyce's fierce devotion to preserving his innocence and creativity in the face of economic pressure and social judgment that might have forced him to grow up too quickly, becoming one of her most important maternal missions. Her insistence that he continue pursuing artistic interests, despite their impractical nature, demonstrated her understanding that children needed dreams and beauty as much as they needed food and shelter. The community support that eventually developed around the Byers family came from neighbors and co-workers who recognized Joyce's determination to provide stable home environment for her children, despite obstacles that might have defeated less committed parents, their offers of assistance reflecting respect for her character rather than pity for her circumstances. The network of informal help that emerged during difficult periods taught Joyce the importance of accepting support when it was offered genuinely and reciprocating whenever her own resources allowed her to assist others facing similar challenges. The resilience that Joyce developed during these years of single parenthood would prove essential when supernatural forces threatened everything she had worked to protect and preserve. Her experience with fighting impossible odds for the sake of her children providing foundation for the even greater battles that awaited when ordinary maternal instincts would be tested against enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience and understanding. The suburban dream that Ted and Karen Wheeler constructed in Hawkins during the early 1970s emerged from the careful accumulation of modest successes and shared aspirations. Their courtship and marriage representing the kind of steady progression toward middle-class stability that characterized young couples who understood that happiness was built through patient attention to details rather than dramatic gestures or unrealistic expectations about what ordinary people could achieve through hard work and mutual commitment. Ted Wheeler's background as the son of a small-town insurance agent provided him with appreciation for the security that came from predictable employment and conservative financial planning. His personality, shaped by parents who had lived through the Depression and understood that comfort was never guaranteed, but had to be earned and protected through careful decision-making and resistance to temptations that might jeopardize long-term stability for short-term gratification. His courtship of Karen Childress unfolded with the methodical approach that he brought to every important decision in his life, their relationship developing through shared activities at church socials and community events where they could observe each other's character in situations that revealed true nature rather than simply the attractive facades that people often presented during the early stages of romantic pursuit. The quiet dinners at modest restaurants, the walks through Hawkins' downtown district, and the conversations on her parents' front porch created foundation for trust that would sustain them through decades of marriage. Karen's own upbringing in a household where traditional gender roles were accepted without question had prepared her for life as a supportive wife and devoted mother, though her intelligence and natural leadership abilities suggested capabilities that extended beyond the domestic sphere into areas where women of her generation were rarely encouraged to explore their potential. The secretarial skills she had developed through business school provided her with organizational abilities and attention to detail that would prove invaluable in managing the complex logistics that family life would eventually require. Their wedding in 1968 represented the culmination of a courtship that had satisfied both sets of parents and met community expectations for young people who were serious about building lasting relationships based on shared values and compatible goals, rather than the passionate intensity that might burn brightly but lacked the steady warmth necessary for sustained partnership. The modest ceremony at Hawkins Community Church was followed by a reception that reflected their practical approach to celebrating important milestones without incurring debts that might burden their early married life. The small house they purchased on Maple Street with assistance from Ted's father represented their commitment to establishing roots in Hawkins and building the kind of stable home environment where children could grow up feeling secure and valued. The mortgage payments requiring careful budgeting, but providing the satisfaction that came from investing in their own future rather than paying rent that would never build equity or create lasting wealth that might be passed on to the next generation. Ted's position at the regional office of a national insurance company offered the combination of steady income and advancement opportunities that made him an attractive marriage prospect, while providing work that utilized his natural caution and attention to detail in ways that felt meaningful and important to someone who understood that protecting other people's security was valuable service, regardless of how routine it might sometimes seem to outsiders who underestimated the importance of reliable institutions. Karen's transition from working woman to full-time homemaker occurred with her first pregnancy, though she occasionally expressed private regrets about abandoning career aspirations that had included dreams of using her intelligence and organizational skills in professional contexts that might have provided more intellectual stimulation than domestic routines typically offered. The choice to prioritize family over career reflected the social expectations of their era rather than lack of ambition or capability on her part. Nancy's birth in 1969 brought joy that was complicated by the steep learning curve that first-time parenthood imposed on people whose previous experience with children had been limited to occasional babysitting and holiday visits with relatives. their adjustment to the constant demands of infant care requiring patience and flexibility that tested, but ultimately strengthened their partnership as they learned to divide responsibilities and support each other through sleep, deprivation, and uncertainty. The early years of Nancy's childhood revealed her parents' different approaches to child rearing, Ted's natural reserve creating emotional distance that he mistook for appropriate paternal dignity, while Karen's more nurturing instincts found expression in the countless small acts of care and attention that made their daughter feel cherished and valued. Despite her father's difficulty expressing affection in ways that young children could easily understand and appreciate, the decision to have additional children reflected their belief that siblings provided important companionship and learning opportunities that only children missed. Though the financial pressures that each new family member created required increasingly careful management of household resources and greater reliance on Karen's ability to stretch limited budgets to cover expanding lists of necessities and occasional luxuries that made family life more enjoyable and memorable. Mike's arrival in 1971 added dimensions to family dynamics that neither parent had anticipated. His more outgoing personality and natural leadership abilities, creating different kinds of parenting challenges than Nancy's compliant nature had presented. His energy and curiosity requiring supervision and guidance that tested Ted's patience, while inspiring Karen's protective instincts in ways that sometimes conflicted with her husband's more hands-off approach to discipline and character development. The basement that would eventually become central to Mike's social life and the setting for adventures that none of them could have imagined began as Ted's attempt to create personal space where he could pursue hobbies and interests that domestic life rarely accommodated. His workshop gradually expanding to include recreational areas where the children could play during inclement weather without disrupting Karen's efforts to maintain order and cleanliness in the main living areas of their home. The television that Ted installed in the basement represented his compromise between his desire for peace and quiet during evening hours, and his recognition that children needed entertainment options that would keep them occupied without requiring constant parental supervision, though he could never have predicted that the basement would eventually become command center for operations that would determine the fate of their community and possibly the entire world. Karen's daily routines during the children's early years established rhythms that would define the family's sense of normalcy and security. Her careful attention to nutritious meals and clean clothes, and homework supervision, creating the stable environment where Mike and Nancy could develop their individual talents and interests without worrying about whether their basic needs would be met consistently and reliably by parents who understood their responsibilities. The neighborhood relationships that developed around their children's friendships provided Karen with social connections that helped alleviate the isolation that full-time motherhood could create for intelligent women whose educational backgrounds had prepared them for more intellectually stimulating pursuits than the domestic routines that consumed most of their time and energy during the years when children required constant attention and supervision. The birthday parties and holiday celebrations that Karen organized with meticulous attention to detail became treasured memories for children who would later look back on these gatherings as evidence of how much their parents had loved them, even when daily interactions might have been complicated by the stresses and misunderstandings that characterized family life in households where everyone was learning to balance individual needs with collective responsibilities. Nancy's academic excellence and social success in elementary school reflected the values that both parents had emphasized regarding the importance of education and character development. Though her perfectionist tendencies sometimes created pressure, that Ted failed to recognize while Karen worried privately about whether their daughter was pushing herself too hard in efforts to meet expectations that might have been unreasonably high for someone so young. Mike's creative imagination and natural leadership among his peer group demonstrated qualities that both parents recognized as potentially valuable for his future success. Though Ted's concern about practical matters sometimes led him to discourage pursuits that seemed too focused on fantasy and not sufficiently grounded in the realistic preparation for adult responsibilities that he believed all young people needed to develop during their formative years. Holly's birth in 1979 completed their family unit and brought unexpected joy to parents who had assumed their child-rearing years were winding down. Her arrival requiring adjustments to household routines and financial planning that had been organized around the needs of two older children who were becoming increasingly independent and required less constant supervision than infants and toddlers demanded from exhausted parents. The family traditions that developed during Holly's early years reflected the Wheelers' commitment to creating positive memories and shared experiences that would bind them together despite the individual differences and competing interests that naturally emerged as children developed their own personalities and began forming relationships outside the immediate family unit that would eventually challenge parental influence and authority. Ted's increasing withdrawal into television viewing and newspaper reading during evening hours represented his response to domestic chaos that sometimes overwhelmed his naturally quiet personality, though his physical presence and steady employment provided forms of security and stability that his family relied upon, even when his emotional availability fell short of what Karen and the children might have preferred from husband and father who was fundamentally decent but struggled with expressions of affection. Karen's growing frustration with the limitations that domestic life imposed on her intelligence and capabilities occasionally manifested in moments of restlessness that she tried to hide from children who needed to believe that their mother was completely fulfilled by the role she had chosen. Though her involvement in community organizations and occasional volunteer work provided outlets for abilities that household management alone could not fully utilize or satisfy, the financial comfort that Ted's steady employment and careful money management provided allowed the family to enjoy middle-class amenities like annual vacations and occasional restaurant meals and Christmas celebrations that reflected their economic security without being ostentatious or wasteful in ways that might have taught the children inappropriate values about the relationship between money and happiness or success and material possessions. The summer camping trips that became annual traditions offered opportunities for family bonding that daily routines rarely provided. Ted's outdoor skills and Karen's organizational abilities combining to create experiences that would remain treasured memories long after the children had established their own households and begun creating traditions that reflected both continuity with their upbringing and adaptations to changed circumstances and different priorities. The basement renovations that Ted undertook during the late 1970s transformed the space from simple storage area into comfortable recreation room where the children could entertain friends without disrupting parental activities or being subjected to constant adult supervision that might have inhibited the kind of free-flowing conversation and creative play that young people needed to develop social skills and individual identity. The Dungeons and Dragons games that Mike and his friends would eventually play in that basement represented exactly the kind of imaginative pursuit that Ted had sometimes discouraged as impractical, though he gradually came to appreciate that fantasy gaming provided mental stimulation and social interaction that contributed positively to his son's development, even if the activities seemed far removed from the practical skills that adult life would eventually require. Karen's relationship with Nancy during the teenage years reflected her own memories of adolescent struggles with identity and independence. Her efforts to provide guidance without being intrusive, requiring delicate balance between protective maternal instincts and recognition that growing children needed freedom to make their own mistakes and learn from experiences that parents could not shield them from indefinitely. The household that Ted and Karen had created through 15 years of marriage and child rearing represented their version of the American dream, realized through modest ambitions and steady effort. Their comfortable home providing foundation for children who would grow up feeling secure enough to take risks and pursue adventures that their parents' more cautious generation might never have attempted or even imagined possible. The love that bound the Wheeler family together, though sometimes expressed imperfectly and inconsistently, would prove strong enough to withstand tests that no amount of careful planning could have prepared them to face. Their commitment to each other, providing anchor points that would hold steady, even when supernatural forces threatened to destroy everything they had worked so carefully to build and protect for the children they had raised, with hopes that the world would remain safe and predictable enough for ordinary families to flourish without encountering dangers that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The boy who would become Steve Harrington learned his earliest lessons about love from parents whose own relationship demonstrated that financial success could not fill the emotional voids that developed when two people chose partnership for practical reasons rather than genuine affection. Their marriage serving as blueprint for the kind of hollow prosperity that substituted material comfort for authentic connection and left children to navigate the complexities of human relationships without adequate guidance or modeling from adults who had never mastered such skills themselves. The Harrington household on Cornwallis Street represented everything that middle-class aspiration could achieve through careful career planning and strategic social positioning. Its spacious rooms filled with furniture, selected more for appearance than comfort, and decorated according to magazine photographs that promised sophistication while delivering sterility that reflected the emotional temperature of relationships that prioritized image over substance and performance, over authenticity in ways that shaped young Steve's understanding of what success was supposed to look like. Richard Harrington's career in corporate management provided the family with financial security that allowed them to maintain appearances appropriate to their social standing. Though his dedication to professional advancement required travel schedules and work commitments that kept him absent during most of the meaningful moments when children needed paternal guidance and emotional support that no amount of expensive gifts could substitute for when delivered by parents who viewed parenthood as obligation rather than privilege. Linda Harrington's involvement in Hawkins's social scene reflected her understanding that maintaining the family's reputation required careful cultivation of relationships with other families whose economic and social status matched their own, her activities ranging from charity fundraisers to country club events that provided opportunities for networking and status reinforcement, while consuming time and emotional energy that might otherwise have been invested in deeper connections with husband and son, who needed her attention more than community organizations required her participation. The isolation that characterized Steve's early childhood resulted not from lack of material advantages, but from the absence of genuine emotional engagement from parents whose own relationship had been built upon practical considerations rather than love. Their interactions with each other marked by polite courtesy that masked deeper disappointments and unmet needs that neither was willing to acknowledge or address through the kind of honest communication that healthy marriages required to survive and flourish. The bedroom that served as Steve's sanctuary during those formative years reflected his parents' approach to child rearing through material provision rather than emotional investment. Its expensive furnishings and latest electronics, representing their attempts to demonstrate love through purchases, while avoiding the more difficult work of building actual relationships that required time and vulnerability and willingness to prioritize family connections over professional and social obligations that seemed more important because they provided tangible rewards. The loneliness that became Steve's constant companion manifested differently than the isolation experienced by children from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, his emptiness arising not from lack of resources, but from abundance that could not address the fundamental human need for connection and belonging that money could never purchase, regardless of how generously it was applied to problems that required emotional rather than financial solutions. The elementary school years that might have provided opportunities for forming friendships were complicated by Steve's early awareness that his family's wealth created barriers between himself and classmates whose parents worked different kinds of jobs and lived in different neighborhoods. His natural desire for authentic connection, conflicting with social dynamics that made him valuable as acquaintance but suspect as genuine friend to children, who understood that economic differences could make relationships difficult to navigate. The athletic abilities that Steve discovered during middle school provided his first experience with earning approval based on his own efforts rather than his family's financial status. The basketball court and baseball diamond becoming spaces where performance was measured by skill and dedication rather than designer clothing or expensive equipment, though even these pursuits were eventually complicated by parental expectations that viewed sports as opportunities for college scholarships and social advancement, rather than simple enjoyment. The popularity that Steve achieved during his freshman year at Hawkins High represented both triumph and tragedy. His success in gaining acceptance from peers, who admired his confidence and charisma, masking the reality that the personality he had developed was carefully constructed facade, designed to protect vulnerabilities that he had learned early, to hide from people who might use such knowledge to cause emotional damage that his parents had never taught him how to process or heal. The relationship with Tommy Hagen and Carol Perkins that defined Steve's social circle during his early high school years provided the closest approximation to family that he had experienced since early childhood. Their crude humor and casual cruelty, serving as substitute for genuine intimacy, while offering protection against the kind of emotional exposure that real friendship would have required from someone whose own family had never modeled healthy relationship dynamics or conflict resolution skills. The house parties that became Steve's specialty during his junior year represented his attempt to create the kind of warm, welcoming environment that his own home had never provided. Though the celebrations he hosted were marked by excess and recklessness that reflected his uncertainty about how to build authentic community, when his only models for social interaction had been his parents' superficial entertaining and his friends' mean-spirited bonding over shared superiority to classmates they perceived as weaker or different. The academic struggles that Steve experienced throughout high school resulted not from lack of intelligence, but from absence of study skills and work habits that children typically learned from parents who valued education and provided support for learning. His grades reflecting the reality that success in school required more than natural ability when teachers and homework competed for attention, with social activities that seemed more immediately rewarding and emotionally satisfying. The relationship with Nancy Wheeler that began during his senior year represented Steve's first encounter with someone whose authenticity and moral clarity challenged the shallow values that had governed his previous interactions with peers. Her combination of intelligence and kindness, forcing him to question whether the person he had become was someone he actually wanted to be, or simply someone he had constructed to survive in environments where genuine vulnerability was punished rather than rewarded. The transformation that Nancy's influence initiated in Steve's character proceeded slowly and imperfectly. his attempts to become worthy of her respect and affection, revealing how little he understood about healthy relationship dynamics when his primary models had been parents whose marriage was based on convenience rather than love and friends, whose loyalty was contingent upon maintaining shared superiority over people they considered beneath their social status. The party at his house that ended with Barb Holland's disappearance marked the beginning of Steve's education in consequence and responsibility, the guilt he experienced over his role in creating circumstances that led to tragedy, forcing him to confront the reality that his actions affected other people in ways that casual cruelty and thoughtless behavior could never acknowledge or repair through simple apologies or attempts to minimize damage that had already been inflicted. The confrontation with Jonathan Byers that resulted from Steve's attempts to cope with guilt through victim blaming demonstrated how inadequately his upbringing had prepared him for situations that required genuine empathy and moral courage. His initial response to crisis revealing character defects that Nancy's influence was only beginning to address through patient example and unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of social consequences. The decision to return to the Byers house and help fight the Demogorgon represented Steve's first act of genuine heroism, his choice to risk personal safety for people who had every reason to reject his assistance, marking the moment when his transformation from selfish teenager to trustworthy friend became irreversible commitment rather than temporary behavior modification designed to impress someone whose approval he wanted to earn. The relationship with Dustin Henderson that developed during the following year provided Steve with opportunities to practice the kind of mentoring and protection that he had never received from his own father, their unlikely friendship demonstrating his capacity for loyalty and care when directed towards someone who needed guidance, rather than someone who could provide social advancement or emotional validation. The job at Scoops Ahoy that followed his high school graduation represented Steve's first experience with employment that required actual work rather than relying on family connections. The humbling reality of minimum wage service industry, labor teaching him lessons about dignity and self-reliance that his privileged upbringing had never required him to learn through direct experience with economic necessity or workplace accountability. The friendship with Robin Buckley that emerged from their shared employment at the ice cream shop provided Steve with his first experience of genuine platonic relationship with someone whose intelligence and wit challenged him intellectually while offering acceptance that was not contingent upon his appearance or social status. Her influence helping him develop appreciation for qualities in himself and others that extended beyond superficial characteristics that had previously defined his social interactions. The revelation of Robin's sexuality and his immediate acceptance of her authentic identity demonstrated how completely Steve's values had shifted from the narrow-minded prejudices that had characterized his earlier years. His loyalty to friends now, based on character and mutual respect, rather than conformity to social expectations that he had learned to recognize as arbitrary and often harmful to people who deserved better treatment from their community. The ongoing evolution of Steve's relationship with Nancy, despite their romantic separation, reflected his growing understanding that love could take multiple forms, and that caring for someone did not always require possessing them or demanding reciprocation of feelings that might have changed due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. His maturity, allowing him to support her happiness even when it meant accepting that their future paths might lead in different directions. The protective instincts that Steve developed toward the younger members of their group demonstrated how his early experiences with loneliness and emotional neglect had ultimately taught him to recognize and respond to similar needs in others, his fierce loyalty to Mike and Lucas and Will and Dustin growing from understanding that children deserved the kind of adult support and guidance that he had been forced to find for himself when his own parents were unavailable or unwilling to provide necessary care and attention. The courage that Steve displayed during supernatural crises emerged from his growing understanding that heroism was not about seeking glory or proving superiority, but about protecting people who could not protect themselves. His willingness to face monsters, both literal and metaphorical, reflecting values that his upbringing had never emphasized, but that he had developed through relationships with people whose authentic goodness had inspired him to become someone worthy of their trust and friendship. The house on Cornwallis Street that remained his primary residence, even as his relationship with his parents grew more distant, represented both reminder of his origins and evidence of how completely he had rejected the shallow values that had characterized his early years. His choice to remain in Hawkins, rather than pursuing college or career opportunities elsewhere, demonstrating commitment to community and relationships that transcended the individual ambition that his parents had always assumed would motivate his major life decisions. The legacy that Steve was building through his relationships with friends and community members bore no resemblance to the legacy his parents had imagined for him. Their vision of success based on wealth, accumulation, and social status, falling far short of the impact he was actually making through simple acts of kindness and loyalty that would be remembered long after material achievements had been forgotten by people whose lives he had touched through his transformation from entitled teenager to genuine hero. The foundation of strength that Lucas Sinclair would carry throughout his journey into supernatural heroism was built upon the bedrock of a family that understood the importance of clear expectations and unwavering support. His parents, Charles and Sue Sinclair, creating a household where love expressed itself through consistent guidance and the kind of structured environment that allowed children to develop confidence in their abilities while understanding their responsibilities to themselves and their community. Charles Sinclair's military background provided the family with organizational principles and disciplinary frameworks that transformed daily routines into opportunities for character development. His service in the Army during the Vietnam era, teaching him lessons about leadership and accountability that he applied to civilian life with the same dedication that had earned him respect among fellow soldiers who understood that survival often depended upon each person fulfilling their obligations to the group without exception or excuse. The evening conversations around the Sinclair dinner table reflected Charles's belief that children learned responsibility through participation in family decision-making processes that acknowledged their intelligence while maintaining appropriate boundaries between adult concerns and childhood interests. His approach to parenting, combining respect for his children's individuality with clear expectations about behavior and achievement that left no doubt about the standards they were expected to meet through their own efforts. Sue Sinclair's work as a nurse provided her with intimate understanding of human vulnerability and the importance of compassionate care during times of crisis. Her professional experience with suffering and healing, creating perspective that influenced her approach to motherhood in ways that emphasized emotional intelligence alongside academic achievement and social development. Her shifts at Hawkins General Hospital exposed her to the full spectrum of human experience, from birth to death, joy to tragedy, teaching her that life's most important lessons often came through adversity that tested character and revealed the true nature of individual strength and community support. The The balance that Charles and Sue achieved between structure and flexibility in their parenting approach created an environment where Lucas learned to value both individual achievement and group loyalty. His understanding of personal responsibility, developing alongside appreciation for the ways that strong relationships could amplify individual capabilities when people chose cooperation over competition and mutual support over selfish advancement. Lucas's early childhood was characterized by the kind of busy household energy that emerged when parents who worked demanding jobs still prioritized family time and created opportunities for shared activities that built memories while teaching practical skills and social values that would serve their children throughout their lives, regardless of what specific career paths or personal relationships they eventually chose to pursue. The neighborhood where the Sinclair family lived reflected Hawkins' character as a community where working families could afford decent housing and safe environments for raising children. The tree-lined streets and well-maintained yards, providing backdrop for the kind of innocent adventures that small-town childhoods made possible when parents felt secure enough about local safety to allow their children significant freedom to explore and discover the world around them through direct experience rather than constant supervision. The friendship between Lucas and Dustin Henderson began during their elementary school years when both boys discovered shared interests in science fiction and fantasy that set them apart from classmates who were more interested in conventional sports and social activities. Their bond strengthened by complementary personalities that allowed them to support each other's individual strengths while compensating for personal weaknesses through cooperative problem-solving and mutual encouragement. Dustin's household presented a different model of family structure that nonetheless shared essential values about education and character development with the Sinclair family. Claudia Henderson's dedication to her son as a single mother, creating the kind of intense bonding that often developed when circumstances required family members to depend heavily upon each other for both practical support and emotional connection that might otherwise be distributed among larger family networks. The absence of Dustin's father from their household created challenges that Claudia addressed through her own resourcefulness and the informal support network that developed among neighbors and friends who understood that raising children successfully required community involvement rather than relying solely upon nuclear family resources that might be inadequate when faced with the complex demands that modern childhood placed upon parents who were often struggling with their own adult responsibilities and uncertainties. Claudia's work schedule as a secretary required careful coordination with Dustin's school activities and social commitments. Her organizational skills and natural warmth creating stability that allowed her son to develop the confidence and curiosity that would serve him well during future crises, when his scientific knowledge and technological abilities would prove essential to group survival and success against enemies that conventional approaches could never hope to defeat effectively. The basement workshop that Charles Sinclair maintained provided Lucas with hands-on education in mechanical principles and problem-solving techniques that complemented the theoretical knowledge he gained through formal education. Father and son spending weekend hours working on projects that ranged from simple repairs to complex construction tasks that required patience and precision, while offering opportunities for the kind of unstructured conversation that allowed them to discuss topics that might not arise during more formal family interactions. The military discipline that influenced Charles's approach to these teaching moments never overwhelmed the joy and discovery that characterized their shared exploration of how things worked and why certain approaches succeeded while others failed. His understanding that effective leadership required inspiration as well as instruction, creating learning experiences that built competence alongside confidence in ways that prepared Lucas for leadership roles he would eventually assume when circumstances demanded quick thinking and decisive action. Sue's influence on Lucas's emotional development manifested through her nursing experience with patients who faced medical crises that tested their psychological resilience as much as their physical strength. Her stories about courage and compassion during difficult times, providing her son with models of how ordinary people could respond to extraordinary challenges through determination and willingness to support each other rather than retreating into self-protection that might preserve individual safety while abandoning collective responsibility. The household routines that governed the Sinclair family's daily life reflected their shared commitment to balancing individual pursuits with family obligations. Lucas, learning to manage his time effectively between homework and chores and social activities while understanding that each aspect of his life contributed to his overall development as someone who could be trusted with increasing levels of responsibility and independence, as he demonstrated readiness for such advancement. Erica Sinclair's arrival in the family dynamic added complexity that tested everyone's ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the stability and mutual support that had characterized their relationships. During Lucas's early childhood, her precocious intelligence and strong personality requiring parenting approaches that acknowledged her individual needs, while ensuring that family harmony remained intact despite the challenges that strong-willed children could present to even well-established household systems. The sibling relationship that developed between Lucas and Erica reflected their parents' success in creating an environment where competition was balanced by cooperation and individual achievement was celebrated without diminishing appreciation for family loyalty and mutual support. Their interactions demonstrating how children could maintain distinct personalities while sharing fundamental values that would sustain them through future challenges that might test their bond in ways that childhood conflicts could never approximate. The academic expectations that both Sinclair parents maintained for their children were grounded in their understanding that education provided opportunities for advancement that previous generations of their families had not always been able to access. Their emphasis on scholastic achievement, reflecting not pressure for its own sake, but recognition that knowledge and critical thinking skills would be essential tools for navigating an increasingly complex world that rewarded preparation and punished ignorance or complacency. The Henderson household's different approach to similar goals created interesting contrasts that enriched the friendship between Lucas and Dustin. Claudia's more permissive style, allowing for creative exploration and intellectual curiosity that sometimes pushed boundaries while still maintaining clear expectations about basic behavior and academic performance that demonstrated her commitment to her son's long-term success. Despite her willingness to accommodate his unconventional interests and learning style, the science fair projects and academic competitions that both boys participated in provided opportunities for collaborative learning that strengthened their friendship while developing skills that would prove unexpectedly valuable during supernatural encounters that required rapid analysis of unfamiliar phenomena and creative application of scientific principles to problems that existed far beyond the scope of normal classroom instruction or textbook knowledge. The community involvement that characterized both families reflected Hawkins' character as a town where residents understood their obligations to support local institutions and activities that benefited everyone's children rather than limiting their concern to immediate family interests. Parent-teacher conferences and school fundraising events and youth sports leagues providing contexts where adults modeled civic engagement and social responsibility for children who were learning about citizenship through observation and participation. The church attendance that provided spiritual framework for both households offered additional opportunities for moral education and community connection. The values emphasized during Sunday services and youth group activities, reinforcing lessons about service and compassion that parents taught through daily example, while providing children with broader perspective on their place in communities that extended beyond immediate neighborhood boundaries. The summer activities that occupied Lucas and Dustin during school breaks ranged from organized camps and sports programs to informal adventures that took them throughout Hawkins and surrounding areas, their exploration of local landmarks and natural features, providing them with detailed knowledge of terrain that would prove strategically important during future crises, when understanding of local geography could mean the difference between successful escape and dangerous entrapment. The basement recreation areas where both families gathered for evening entertainment created spaces where parents and children could interact in relaxed settings that encouraged conversation and shared activities. Television programs and board games and informal discussions providing opportunities for relationship building that complemented the more structured interactions that characterized school days and work weeks when everyone's attention was focused on immediate obligations and deadlines. The birthday celebrations and holiday traditions that marked significant occasions in both households reflected their families' commitment to creating positive memories and strengthening bonds that would endure beyond childhood. The careful attention paid to making these events special, demonstrating how much parents valued their relationships with children and their understanding that family connections required ongoing investment of time and emotional energy to remain strong and meaningful. The neighborhood friendships that developed around the boys' relationship provided both families with informal support networks that proved invaluable during times when individual households faced challenges that required assistance from people who understood their circumstances and cared about their welfare. The mutual aid that emerged naturally from these connections, demonstrating how community strength grew from individual relationships that prioritized generosity and cooperation over competition and self-interest. The foundation of character and capability that both Lucas and Dustin developed through their family experiences would prove essential when supernatural forces threatened everything they valued most. Their parents' careful attention to building resilience and moral courage, creating young men who could face impossible odds with determination and creativity, that reflected the love and wisdom that had shaped their understanding of what it meant to be trustworthy friends and responsible community members, regardless of circumstances. The sensitive soul who had become Jonathan Byers first discovered the power of capturing beauty through mechanical means when his father abandoned a broken camera during one of his periodic departures from family responsibility, the discarded device becoming treasure in the hands of a 10-year-old boy whose artistic instincts recognized possibilities that adult frustration had overlooked in its haste to eliminate reminders of failed hobbies and abandoned dreams. The camera itself was nothing remarkable by professional standards, a simple 35mm model that had been purchased impulsively during one of Lonnie's brief enthusiasms for activities that might provide distraction from the domestic obligations that he found increasingly burdensome as the novelty of marriage and fatherhood gave way to the daily realities of supporting a family through steady work and consistent presence that his restless nature struggled to sustain over extended periods. Jonathan's fascination with the abandoned camera began as simple curiosity about its mechanical components and the mysterious process by which images could be captured and preserved through chemical reactions that seemed like magic to someone whose scientific education had not yet progressed far enough to demystify photography's technical foundations. Though his artistic sensibilities immediately grasped the creative possibilities that the device offered to someone willing to learn its capabilities and limitations. The first photographs that Jonathan successfully developed in the makeshift darkroom he constructed in a corner of their basement revealed natural talent that transcended technical knowledge, his instinctive understanding of composition and lighting, producing images that captured not just visual information but emotional resonance that spoke to viewers in ways that more technically perfect but emotionally vacant photographs could never achieve. Despite superior equipment and professional training, Joyce's recognition of her son's artistic gifts led to her working extra shifts at the store to purchase film and developing supplies that their tight budget could barely accommodate. Her sacrifice reflecting understanding that creative expression was not luxury, but necessity for children whose sensitive natures required outlets that conventional activities could not provide, especially when family circumstances created emotional pressures that needed release through constructive rather than destructive channels. The subjects that drew Jonathan's photographic attention during his early teenage years reflected his developing social consciousness and natural empathy for people whose circumstances placed them outside mainstream acceptance, his camera becoming a tool for documenting the beauty and dignity that existed in situations that other observers might dismiss as unworthy of artistic consideration due to their association with poverty or social marginalization. The technical skills that Jonathan developed through persistent experimentation and careful study of photography magazines borrowed from the public library demonstrated his capacity for self-directed learning when motivated by genuine passion. His understanding of aperture settings and exposure times and darkroom chemistry advancing rapidly as he discovered that mastery of technique enabled more effective expression of the artistic vision that drove his dedication to the medium. The relationship between Jonathan and Will during these formative years was characterized by protective tenderness that reflected their shared experience of growing up in a household where adult reliability could not be assumed and emotional security had to be created through mutual support, rather than dependence upon parental consistency, that their father's behavior patterns had proven unreliable and their mother's work demands sometimes made difficult to maintain, despite her unwavering love and commitment. The bedtime stories that Jonathan told Will during the periods when Joyce's work schedule required her to be away from home during evening hours drew upon his growing understanding of narrative structure and character development. His exposure to photography, having awakened interest in all forms of storytelling that could capture human experience and communicate it in ways that touched viewers or listeners at emotional levels that transcended simple entertainment, to become sources of comfort and connection. The school assignments that allowed Jonathan to incorporate his photographic interests provided opportunities for academic success that might otherwise have eluded someone whose family circumstances created distractions and responsibilities that interfered with conventional study habits. His teachers, recognizing that his artistic talents deserved encouragement even when his other academic performance reflected the challenges of maintaining focus. When home life demanded maturity and problem-solving skills that most teenagers were not required to develop, the darkroom that Jonathan eventually established in their basement became sanctuary where he could process both film and emotions. The quiet hours spent in red-lit solitude providing respite from family responsibilities and social pressures, while allowing him to create images that expressed perspectives and feelings that verbal communication might fail to convey adequately to people whose experiences had been different from his own. The musical education that Jonathan received through his exposure to artists whose work appeared on album covers and concert photographs expanded his understanding of how different art forms could complement and enhance each other. His appreciation for musicians who challenged conventional expectations, paralleling his own approach to photography that sought subjects and compositions that revealed hidden truths, rather than confirming comfortable assumptions about reality. The record collection that Jonathan assembled through careful expenditure of money, earned through odd jobs and small photography commissions, reflected his developing taste for music that addressed complex emotions and social issues. Artists like The Clash and Joy Division, providing soundtracks for darkroom sessions where he developed photographs that captured similar themes of alienation and resilience in visual form. The friendship patterns that Jonathan established during high school reflected his natural gravitation toward people who shared his interest in authentic expression over social conformity. Though his responsibilities at home and his naturally introverted personality limited his ability to pursue the kind of extensive social relationships that might have provided additional emotional support during the stressful period when his father's final departure forced him to assume even greater responsibility for family stability. The part-time employment that Jonathan secured at the Hawkins Post during his junior year provided both income that helped support his family and professional experience that expanded his understanding of how photography could be used to inform and influence public opinion. Though the newspaper's limited resources and conservative editorial policies often restricted his creative freedom in ways that frustrated his developing artistic ambitions, the assignments that took Jonathan throughout Hawkins and surrounding areas with his camera provided him with comprehensive knowledge of local geography and social dynamics that would prove valuable during future crises. His documentation of community events and local personalities, creating archive of normal life that would take on poignant significance when supernatural forces threatened to destroy everything familiar and comfortable about their small-town existence. The relationship with his mother that deepened during the years when they functioned essentially as single-parent household reflected their mutual recognition that survival required cooperation and understanding that transcended typical parent-child boundaries. Joyce's trust in Jonathan's judgment and reliability, creating partnership that prepared both of them for challenges that conventional family structures might have handled through division of labor that their circumstances made impossible. The protective instincts that Jonathan developed toward Will manifested in countless small acts of care and attention that ranged from helping with homework to defending him against bullies who targeted his sensitive nature and artistic interests, their brotherhood strengthening through shared adversity while maintaining individual identities that allowed both to pursue personal interests without sacrificing family loyalty or mutual support. The camera that had begun as discarded equipment gradually evolved into an essential tool for both artistic expression and family documentation. Jonathan's photographs of Will and Joyce and their modest home creating visual record of love and resilience that would become precious artifacts during periods when the future of their family unit seemed uncertain or threatened by forces beyond their control. The developing social consciousness that informed Jonathan's choice of photographic subjects reflected his growing awareness that art could serve purposes beyond personal satisfaction. His images of economic inequality and social injustice, representing early attempts to use his talents in service of broader concerns about fairness and compassion that his own family's struggles had taught him to recognize and value in both personal relationships and community policies. The technical expertise that Jonathan achieved through years of dedicated practice positioned him as informal photographer for school events and community activities, though his preference for candid shots over posed portraits reflected artistic philosophy that valued authenticity over conventional attractiveness and genuine emotion over artificial presentation designed to meet social expectations about appropriate public image. The basement darkroom that had started as simple hobby space gradually became professional quality facility where Jonathan could produce work that met commercial standards. His investment in better equipment and supplies representing commitment to photography as potential career rather than merely recreational activity, though family financial pressures meant that any income from his artistic work needed to contribute to household expenses rather than funding purely personal projects. The portfolio that Jonathan assembled during his final years of high school demonstrated range and sophistication that impressed teachers and community members who understood photography well enough to recognize exceptional talent when they encountered it. Though his plans for pursuing further education in art or journalism remained uncertain due to economic realities that made college attendance difficult, without scholarships or financial aid that might not be available to students whose academic records reflected divided attention between studies and family responsibilities. The moral compass that guided Jonathan's artistic choices reflected values that had been shaped by his mother's example of sacrifice and perseverance, his photographs consistently demonstrating respect for human dignity and appreciation for beauty that could be found in unexpected places. When viewed by someone whose experiences with hardship had taught him to recognize strength and grace under pressure as worthy subjects for artistic documentation and celebration. The relationship between Jonathan's photography and his developing sense of social justice created synergy that would influence his approach to both artistic expression and civic engagement throughout his life. His understanding that images could change minds and hearts, making him increasingly conscious of the responsibility that came with the ability to shape public perception through careful selection and presentation of visual information that might influence important decisions about community welfare and individual rights. The girl who would become Nancy Wheeler entered the world with the kind of natural perfectionism that marked her as someone destined to excel in environments where achievement was measured through conventional metrics. Her early childhood characterized by the effortless grace with which she navigated social expectations, while maintaining individual identity that suggested depths of character that superficial observers might easily overlook or underestimate. The Wheeler household's emphasis on proper behavior and academic excellence provided Nancy with framework for success that she embraced with genuine enthusiasm rather than reluctant compliance. Her natural intelligence, finding expression through school assignments and extracurricular activities that allowed her to demonstrate capabilities that extended far beyond the decorative femininity that 1970s and 80s social conventions often expected from girls of her background and circumstances. Her relationship with her parents during those formative years reflected the complex dynamics that characterized families where love was expressed through expectation rather than unconditional acceptance. Ted's emotional distance creating space that Nancy learned to fill through achievement, while Karen's more nurturing but occasionally frustrated presence provided model for how women could maintain grace and dignity even when personal dreams remained largely unfulfilled by domestic circumstances that prioritized family stability over individual ambition. The friendship with Barbara Holland that became central to Nancy's social and emotional development during her elementary and middle school years emerged from shared values about integrity and kindness that set both girls apart from classmates who seemed more interested in popularity contests and social hierarchies than genuine connection or intellectual growth, their bond strengthening through mutual respect and understanding that transcended the superficial concerns that often dominated teenage relationships. Barb's influence on Nancy's character development proved crucial during periods when social pressures might have led someone less grounded toward compromises that could have altered her trajectory in ways that would have diminished her natural strengths. Her friend's unwavering commitment to authentic values, providing anchor point that kept Nancy connected to her better instincts, even when circumstances made such consistency difficult or socially disadvantageous. The academic excellence that Nancy achieved throughout her school years reflected not just natural intelligence, but disciplined work habits that her parents had encouraged through consistent expectations and appropriate rewards. Her understanding that education provided foundation for future opportunities, motivating her to pursue knowledge for its own sake, rather than merely meeting minimum requirements for advancement to the next grade level or graduation milestone. The extracurricular activities that Nancy participated in during high school demonstrated her natural leadership abilities and organizational skills that complemented her academic achievements. Her involvement in student government and various clubs, providing opportunities to develop public speaking confidence and collaborative problem-solving experience that would prove valuable throughout her life, regardless of what specific career path she eventually chose to pursue. The relationship with her younger brother Mike during their childhood and adolescence reflected the protective instincts that characterized Nancy's approach to people she cared about. Her willingness to defend him against bullies or unfair treatment, demonstrating fierce loyalty that coexisted with occasionally impatient reactions to his more impulsive behavior patterns and unconventional interests that sometimes embarrassed her during social situations where image management seemed important. The basement that served as Mike's primary recreational space represented territory that Nancy generally avoided due to its association with activities that seemed childish or inappropriate for someone who was trying to establish mature identity, though her occasional participation in family game nights or movie watching demonstrated that her desire for sophistication did not completely override affection for siblings whose interests differed from her own developing preferences. The bedroom that Nancy carefully decorated and maintained as personal sanctuary reflected her growing sense of individual taste and her desire to create environments that expressed personality while meeting parental expectations about appropriate feminine interests. The balance between conformity and self-expression that characterized her decorating choices, paralleling similar negotiations in other areas of her life where social expectations competed with personal preferences. The part-time employment that Nancy secured during her junior year at a local retail establishment provided her with first experience of workplace dynamics and customer service challenges that broadened her understanding of adult responsibilities, while contributing to family finances in ways that demonstrated her commitment to pulling her own weight, rather than simply accepting parental support without reciprocal contribution to household welfare. The relationship with Steve Harrington that developed during her senior year represented Nancy's first serious romantic involvement and her introduction to the complex emotional territory that intimate relationships required. Her natural caution and moral clarity creating tension with Steve's initially more casual approach to dating that reflected differences in their family backgrounds and personal values that would need to be resolved for their relationship to develop successfully. The attraction that Nancy felt towards Steve's confidence and social status was balanced by growing awareness that his popular persona masked insecurities and character defects that could pose long-term problems for someone whose own identity was built upon authenticity and moral consistency. Her efforts to encourage positive changes in his behavior, demonstrating her belief that people could grow and improve when supported by partners who genuinely cared about their development. The friendship with Jonathan Byers that began as shared concern for their missing friend Will gradually evolved into something deeper and more complex as Nancy recognized qualities in Jonathan that her relationship with Steve had taught her to value more highly than the superficial characteristics that had initially attracted her to someone whose popularity and material advantages could not compensate for emotional unavailability or moral ambiguity. The investigation into Barb's disappearance that Nancy pursued despite official discouragement demonstrated her unwillingness to accept convenient explanations when her own experience suggested that more complex and disturbing truths lay hidden beneath surface appearances. Her persistence in seeking answers, reflecting both loyalty to her missing friend and growing confidence in her own judgment about when adult authority figures were failing to meet their responsibilities. The decision to enter the Upside Down in search of the monster that had taken Barb required forms of courage that Nancy's conventional upbringing had never prepared her to develop. Her willingness to face supernatural dangers for the sake of someone she loved, revealing reserves of strength and determination that surprised even those who knew her best and had recognized her potential for leadership and moral action. The guilt that Nancy experienced over her inability to save Barb created emotional weight that influenced her subsequent relationships and decision-making processes. Her understanding that good intentions and brave actions could not always prevent tragic outcomes, teaching her hard lessons about the limitations of individual agency when confronted with forces that operated beyond normal human comprehension or control. The partnership with Jonathan that emerged from their shared traumatic experiences created bond that transcended romantic attraction to encompass mutual respect and understanding that had been forged through crisis and tested under conditions that revealed true character rather than carefully constructed social personas designed to meet external expectations about appropriate behavior or attractive personality traits. The academic opportunities that Nancy's excellent grades and extracurricular achievements made available to her represented possibilities for future advancement that previous generations of women in her family had not been able to access. Her awareness of these expanded options creating both excitement about potential careers and pressure to make choices that would honor the sacrifices that others had made to create such opportunities. The expectation that Nancy would pursue higher education and professional success reflected changing social attitudes about women's roles and capabilities. Though she remained conscious that balancing career ambitions with personal relationships would require careful navigation of cultural expectations that had not yet fully adapted to accommodate women who wanted both professional fulfillment and family happiness, without sacrificing either set of aspirations completely. The investigative instincts that Nancy developed through her experiences with supernatural mysteries translated into broader curiosity about social issues and institutional failures that affected community welfare. Her growing awareness that official versions of events often obscured important truths, creating skepticism about authority that would influence her approach to journalism and civic engagement throughout her adult life. The relationship with her parents that evolved during her later high school years reflected Nancy's increasing maturity and independence while maintaining respect for family values that had shaped her fundamental character. Her ability to pursue individual goals without rejecting parental guidance, demonstrating emotional intelligence that allowed her to grow while preserving important connections that provided stability and support. The friendship networks that Nancy cultivated during her final years in Hawkins demonstrated her ability to maintain relationships across social boundaries that might have seemed insurmountable to people with more rigid ideas about appropriate peer groups. Her genuine interest in people as individuals rather than social symbols, allowing her to form connections based on character and shared values rather than superficial compatibility or mutual advantage. The leadership roles that Nancy assumed in various school and community activities prepared her for adult responsibilities that would require ability to motivate others and coordinate complex projects while maintaining focus on long-term goals that might not provide immediate gratification or recognition. Her experience with successful collaboration, teaching her skills that would prove valuable in professional contexts, where teamwork and communication determined outcomes. The moral courage that Nancy demonstrated during supernatural crises established patterns of behavior that would characterize her approach to ethical challenges throughout her life. Her willingness to risk personal safety and social acceptance for the sake of protecting others and pursuing truth, reflecting values that her upbringing had instilled, but that her own experiences had tested and confirmed through practical application under extreme pressure. The foundation of strength and integrity that Nancy built during her adolescent years through careful attention to character development and authentic self-expression would sustain her through adult challenges that required similar reserves of determination and moral clarity. Her understanding that personal happiness and social contribution both depended upon remaining true to fundamental values, regardless of external pressures or convenient alternatives that might offer easier but ultimately less satisfying paths forward. The young woman who would become Robin Buckley spent her earliest years in Hawkins understanding that she was different from other children in ways that she could not yet articulate or fully comprehend. Her natural intelligence and quick wit making her stand out in classrooms where academic excellence was appreciated, while her deeper sense of otherness remained hidden beneath the careful performance of normalcy that small-town social expectations required from anyone who hoped to navigate childhood without becoming target for cruelty that communities often directed toward those who failed to conform to unwritten rules about acceptable behavior. The Buckley household on Cherry Lane reflected the modest aspirations of working-class parents who valued education as pathway to opportunities that their own limited circumstances had never provided. Robin's father employed as maintenance supervisor at the local high school, while her mother worked part-time at the public library. Their combined income sufficient to maintain comfortable lifestyle, while instilling in their daughter appreciation for knowledge and learning that transcended simple career preparation to encompass genuine curiosity about the world beyond Hawkins' boundaries. Robin's exceptional academic performance throughout elementary school earned recognition from teachers who understood that intellectual giftedness required nurturing and challenge to develop properly, though her tendency towards solitary pursuits and her discomfort with social situations that other children seemed to navigate effortlessly created concerns among adults who worried that academic success without corresponding social pain development might limit her future happiness and adjustment to adult responsibilities that required collaborative skills and emotional intelligence. The languages that Robin began studying during middle school provided her with windows into cultures and perspectives that existed far beyond the narrow confines of small-town Indiana. Her natural facility with French and Spanish opening doorways to literature and ideas that challenged provincial assumptions, while offering glimpses of places where different kinds of people might find acceptance and understanding that their immediate communities could not or would not provide to those whose authentic selves failed to match local expectations. The band program that became Robyn's primary social outlet during her high school years created sanctuary where musical collaboration required individual excellence while contributing to collective achievement. The discipline and precision demanded by instrumental performance, providing structure that complemented her academic pursuits while offering opportunities for creative expression that more conventional social activities could not accommodate for someone whose interests and sensibilities differed markedly from mainstream teenage preoccupations. The trumpet that Robyn mastered through years of dedicated practice became an extension of her voice in contexts where words might have felt inadequate or inappropriate. The technical demands of brass performance, requiring breath control and embouchure development, that translated metaphorically into lessons about patience and persistence that would serve her throughout life when facing challenges that demanded sustained effort rather than immediate gratification, or dramatic gestures that might provide temporary satisfaction without addressing underlying complexities. The friendships that Robyn developed within the band community reflected her growing understanding that authentic connection could emerge among people who shared common goals and mutual respect, even when their individual personalities and backgrounds might seem incompatible to outside observers. Her experiences with musical collaboration teaching her valuable lessons about how diversity of talents and perspectives could enhance group performance when participants remained committed to collective success rather than individual recognition. The crush that Robyn developed on Tammy Thompson during her sophomore year marked her first conscious recognition of romantic feelings that differed from the heterosexual attraction that social conventions expected all teenagers to experience. Though her inability to understand or express these emotions created internal confusion and isolation that intensified her sense of being fundamentally different from peers whose romantic interests seemed to follow predictable and socially acceptable patterns that she could observe, but not authentically replicate. The academic competitions that Robyn participated in throughout high school provided opportunities for intellectual achievement that transcended local boundaries while connecting her with students from other schools whose interests and capabilities more closely matched her own. These experiences offering glimpses of communities where intelligence and curiosity were valued more highly than conformity to social expectations that often seemed arbitrary or restrictive to someone whose natural gifts lay in areas that small-town culture did not always appreciate or reward. The part-time employment that Robyn secured during her junior year at a local bookstore provided her with access to literature and ideas that might otherwise have remained beyond her reach, her discount privileges allowing her to build a personal library that included works by authors whose perspectives on identity and sexuality began to provide vocabulary and context for feelings and experiences that she had previously been unable to name or understand within frameworks that her conventional upbringing had provided. The internal struggle that Robyn experienced as she gradually acknowledged her authentic sexual identity created emotional tension that she learned to manage through humor and intellectual pursuits that provided distraction from psychological discomfort while allowing her to maintain the facade of normalcy that social survival seemed to require in environments where deviation from heterosexual assumptions could result in ostracism or worse consequences that she had witnessed inflicted upon other students who had been less successful at concealing their differences. The isolation that accompanied Robyn's growing self-awareness manifested in increasingly sophisticated defense mechanisms that used wit and sarcasm to deflect personal questions while maintaining social connections that provided necessary camouflage without requiring the kind of authentic vulnerability that might have exposed her to rejection or persecution from people whose acceptance she needed for practical reasons, even when their friendship could not extend to complete honesty about her true nature. The academic success that Robin continued to achieve, despite her internal struggles, demonstrated remarkable resilience and compartmentalization abilities that allowed her to excel in areas where performance could be measured objectively, while managing private emotional territory that required constant vigilance and careful self-monitoring to prevent accidental disclosure that might have catastrophic social consequences in community, where traditional values dominated public discourse about acceptable behavior. The college applications that Robin completed during her senior year represented both escape route from social constraints that had limited her authentic self-expression and source of anxiety about whether academic achievements would translate into social acceptance in larger communities where her differences might be less remarkable, but where new forms of judgment and evaluation might present. Challenges that small-town experience had not prepared her to navigate successfully. The relationship with Steve Harrington that developed during their employment at Scoops Ahoy initially reflected Robin's skepticism about popular students whose social success had come at expense of people like herself, though their shared experiences with supernatural crises and genuine friendship that emerged from mutual respect and understanding gradually taught her that character could transcend social categories, and that authentic connection was possible with people whose backgrounds and experiences differed significantly from her own. The decision to confide in Steve about her sexuality represented a leap of faith that required overcoming years of careful concealment and protective cynicism. Her choice to trust someone whose acceptance was not guaranteed, demonstrating courage that had been developed through years of internal struggle and growing self-acceptance that made authentic relationships seem worth the risks that honesty inevitably created in a world that did not always reward truth-telling or celebrate difference. The friendship that deepened between Robin and Steve following her disclosure reflected both his fundamental decency and her accurate assessment of his character development, their platonic bond becoming model for relationships that transcended romantic attraction to encompass mutual support and loyalty that proved more durable and satisfying than many conventional romantic partnerships that lacked similar foundations of respect and understanding. The mentoring role that Robin gradually assumed with younger members of their group demonstrated her natural teaching abilities and her understanding that acceptance and encouragement could provide essential support for people who were struggling with identity issues or social pressures that she recognized from her own experience. Her willingness to share wisdom gained through personal struggle, reflecting growing confidence in her own worth and capabilities. The linguistic skills that Robin continued to develop provided her with career opportunities that might allow her to travel and experience cultures where different perspectives on identity and relationships could broaden her understanding of human diversity while offering professional fulfillment that utilized her intellectual gifts in service of communication and cultural bridge building that matched her natural interests and abilities. The courage that Robin displayed during supernatural encounters reflected internal strength that had been forged through years of navigating social challenges that required constant awareness and strategic thinking. Her ability to remain calm under pressure and contribute meaningfully to group problem-solving efforts, demonstrating that personal struggles with identity and acceptance had developed character traits that proved valuable in crisis situations that demanded clear thinking and cooperative action. The self-acceptance that Robin achieved through her relationships with Steve and other friends who valued her authentic self created foundation for future happiness that did not depend upon concealing essential aspects of her identity or conforming to social expectations that conflicted with her true nature, her growing confidence in her own worth, enabling her to pursue goals and relationships that honored her intelligence and integrity, rather than requiring constant performance of false persona designed to meet others' expectations. The community that Robin began to envision for her future included people who shared her values about honesty and acceptance, while offering opportunities for intellectual growth and creative expression that small-town limitations had never adequately provided. Her understanding that happiness required environments where authentic self-expression was celebrated rather than merely tolerated, motivating her to seek situations and relationships that could sustain long-term fulfillment, rather than temporary security based on concealment or compromise. The legacy that Robin was building through her influence on friends and her commitment to authenticity demonstrated that individual courage in facing personal challenges could create positive ripple effects that benefited entire communities. Her example of self-acceptance and genuine friendship, providing inspiration for others who might be struggling with similar issues, while contributing to gradual social progress that made acceptance and understanding more possible for future generations who deserved better treatment than previous eras had provided to people whose differences challenged conventional assumptions about normal human experience. The woman who would unknowingly become the mother of one of history's most powerful psychic children began her journey toward tragedy during the idealistic ferment of the 1960s, when college campuses across America buzzed with revolutionary energy, and young people believed that their generation possessed both the moral authority and practical capability to reshape society according to principles of justice and compassion that seemed self-evidently superior to the compromised values that governed their parents' world. Terry Ives arrived at Indiana University in 1965, carrying dreams that extended far beyond personal advancement to encompass vision of social transformation that would eliminate poverty and prejudice while establishing communities where human potential could flourish without the artificial limitations that traditional hierarchies imposed upon people whose only crime was being born into circumstances that provided inadequate opportunities for development and self-expression that more privileged individuals took for granted. Her major in psychology reflected genuine curiosity about the mechanisms underlying human behavior, combined with practical desire to develop skills that could be applied toward healing social wounds that seemed to grow wider with each passing year as civil rights struggles and anti-war protests revealed the depth of institutional resistance to changes that younger generations considered both necessary and inevitable if American democracy was to fulfill its founding promises rather than remaining hollow rhetoric used to justify systems that perpetuated inequality. The activism that consumed increasing amounts of Terry's time and emotional energy during her junior and senior years brought her into contact with other students whose commitment to social justice matched her own intensity, while introducing her to ideas about consciousness and human potential that existed at the intersection of political philosophy and emerging psychological theories about the untapped capabilities that conventional, educational, and social systems never encouraged people to explore or develop. The volunteer work that Terry undertook with various community organizations provided her with direct exposure to the suffering that abstract political discussions could never adequately convey. Her experiences with families affected by poverty and discrimination, teaching her that theoretical solutions to social problems required practical implementation that took into account the complex realities faced by people whose daily survival depended upon navigating systems that were often indifferent or actively hostile to their welfare and dignity. The advertisement that would ultimately destroy Terry's life appeared in the campus newspaper during her final semester. Its innocuous language about contributing to important psychological research while earning money to help cover educational expenses, appealing to someone whose financial circumstances made any legitimate opportunity for income seem like providential answer to prayers that she had been offering, about her ability to complete degree requirements without accumulating debts that might limit her future options for graduate study or community service. The interview process that preceded her acceptance into what she believed was university-sponsored research study involved questionnaires and psychological assessments that seemed designed to identify individuals with particular personality traits and intellectual capabilities, though the specific purposes of these evaluations remained vague, despite Terry's attempts to obtain more detailed information about the nature of the work she would be expected to perform in exchange for the generous compensation that made participation attractive to students whose economic situations left them few alternatives for earning necessary income. The laboratory facility where Terry reported for her first session bore no obvious connection to the psychology department that she had assumed was sponsoring the research. Its sterile corridors and security procedures, suggesting medical or scientific work that required higher levels of containment and confidentiality than typical academic studies demanded. Though her questions about these arrangements were deflected with explanations about federal funding requirements and institutional protocols that sounded plausible to someone whose experience with large-scale research projects remained limited. The consent forms that Terry signed before beginning her participation in the study contained language that she found unnecessarily complex and legally dense, though the researchers assured her that such documentation was standard procedure for any investigation that involved human subjects and federal oversight. Their casual dismissal of her concerns, creating impression that her questions reflected inexperience rather than legitimate requests for clarification about commitments she was being asked to make. The initial sessions that Terry attended seemed to involve nothing more challenging than meditation exercises and sensory deprivation experiences that researchers claimed were designed to measure baseline cognitive function and stress responses, the procedures feeling harmless despite their unusual nature and the careful monitoring that accompanied every aspect of her participation. Through equipment that seemed more sophisticated than typical psychology experiments required for data collection, the gradual introduction of pharmaceutical elements into her sessions occurred with explanations about enhancing relaxation and focus that made the additions seem like natural progression in research that was becoming increasingly specialized as it moved toward objectives that required more precise measurement of neurological responses to various stimuli and environmental modifications that could provide insights into consciousness and perception that conventional approaches could never achieve. The pregnancy that resulted from Terry's relationship with Andrew Rich, a fellow volunteer in the research program who had become her romantic partner through shared experiences that created intimacy based on mutual participation in activities that seemed increasingly important and meaningful as their involvement deepened, initially brought joy that was complicated by her growing awareness that the research program might involve elements that could affect fetal development in ways that had not been disclosed during the consent process. The attempts that Terry made to obtain more detailed information about potential risks to her unborn child were met with reassurances that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry rather than provide genuine answers to legitimate concerns that any expectant mother might reasonably raise when participating in medical research that involved unknown substances and procedures whose long-term effects had not been adequately studied or documented through peer review processes that typically governed ethical medical research. The birth of Jane that occurred within the laboratory facility rather than a conventional hospital setting was explained as necessary precaution due to Terry's participation in research that required ongoing monitoring of both mother and child to ensure that no adverse effects developed from exposure to experimental procedures, though the separation that immediately followed delivery contradicted previous assurances that she would be able to maintain normal maternal relationship with her daughter while continuing her involvement in studies that researchers claimed were nearing important breakthrough discoveries. The legal battles that Terry fought to regain custody of Jane consumed years of her life and depleted financial resources that she could not afford to spend on attorney fees and court costs. Her attempts to expose the true nature of the research program, meeting resistance from institutional forces that possessed resources and legal protections that individual citizens could not hope to match when confronting organizations that operated with government sanction and classified funding that placed their activities beyond normal oversight or accountability. The psychological trauma that resulted from Terry's forced separation from Jane and her growing understanding that she had been deceived about the nature of her participation in what was actually a government program designed to create psychic weapons rather than conduct legitimate scientific research created mental instability that manifested in behaviors that opponents used to question her credibility and parental fitness. When custody proceedings finally reached courtrooms, where institutional power typically prevailed over individual rights, the electroshock treatments that were administered to Terry under the guise of medical care for her psychological distress served the dual purpose of supposedly treating her condition while also erasing memories that might have provided evidence of illegal activities and human rights violations that government agencies needed to conceal in order to protect classified programs and the careers of officials who had authorized research that violated ethical standards and constitutional protections that should have prevented such abuses. The catatonic state that Terry eventually entered represented both escape from unbearable psychological pain and tragic confirmation that institutional forces had succeeded in silencing someone whose testimony might have exposed criminal activities that extended far beyond her individual case to encompass systematic abuse of vulnerable people who had trusted government agencies and academic institutions to protect their welfare rather than exploit their circumstances for purposes that served political rather than humanitarian objectives. The daughter who grew up as 11 within the sterile confines of Hawkins National Laboratory never knew the love that her mother had felt for her before institutional cruelty destroyed Terry's ability to express affection or even recognize the child she had carried with such hope and joy. During the months before, government forces intervened to claim Jane for purposes that reduced human beings to experimental subjects whose value was measured solely in terms of their utility for weapons development, rather than their inherent worth as individuals deserving protection and care. The other numbered children who shared Jane's imprisonment within the laboratory represented additional tragedies of families destroyed and lives stolen by research programs that operated beyond public scrutiny or legal accountability, each child carrying within themselves fragments of memories about parents and siblings and normal domestic life that had been interrupted by government agents who arrived with legal documents that granted them authority to separate children from families under circumstances that suggested medical necessity while concealing military objectives. Kali, who became Subject 8 within the laboratory's numbered system, retained stronger memories of her life before captivity than some of her fellow prisoners. Her experiences with family love and community connection, providing psychological resources that helped her maintain sense of identity despite years of conditioning designed to transform children into weapons whose loyalties belonged entirely to handlers who viewed them as assets rather than human, beings deserving basic dignity and protection from exploitation. The Rainbow Room that served as recreational space for the laboratory children represented Dr. Brenner's attempts to create artificial family environment that might provide psychological stability necessary for optimal performance during experimental sessions, though the manufactured warmth of this controlled setting could never replace the authentic love and security that had been stolen from children who deserved normal childhoods, with parents who cared about their happiness rather than their potential military applications. The experiments that defined daily life for the numbered children ranged from seemingly harmless exercises in remote viewing and telepathic communication to increasingly dangerous tasks that required them to use psychic abilities for purposes of espionage and assassination that violated every principle of child protection, while training them to become instruments of government policy that operated beyond constitutional limitations or ethical constraints that normally governed civilized society's treatment of its most vulnerable members. The Papa That Doctor. Brenner insisted the children call him represented grotesque parody of paternal love that substituted control and manipulation for genuine care, while demanding absolute obedience in return for basic necessities and occasional privileges that were presented as rewards for compliance rather than acknowledged as fundamental rights that all children possessed, regardless of their circumstances or the political objectives that their captors hoped to achieve through systematic abuse, disguised as scientific research. The friendships that developed among the laboratory children despite institutional efforts to prevent such connections demonstrated resilience of human need for companionship and mutual support that no amount of conditioning could completely eliminate. Their secret communications and small acts of kindness toward each other, providing psychological lifelines that helped them maintain fragments of humanity in environments designed to reduce them to programmable weapons whose emotions, loyalties could be directed according to military necessity, rather than personal choice. The escape attempts that various children made over the years reflected both desperation of their circumstances and natural human desire for freedom that institutional control could suppress, but never entirely destroy, though the punishments that followed failed escapes served as object lessons designed to discourage similar attempts while demonstrating the futility of resistance against forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in terms of resources and legal authority to reclaim subjects who were classified as government property rather than independent individuals with rights that society was obligated to protect. The massacre that ultimately destroyed most of the laboratory children and enabled Eleven's escape into the wider world represented culmination of years of psychological pressure and systematic abuse that had created unstable conditions where tragedy became inevitable. The violence that erupted serving as terrible testament to what happened when human beings were treated as objects rather than people deserving basic respect and protection from those who claimed authority over their lives and futures. The legacy of suffering that emerged from the laboratory programs extended far beyond immediate victims to encompass families destroyed by government secrecy and communities traumatized by institutional betrayal of trust that citizens had placed in agencies that were supposed to protect rather than exploit vulnérable population. The ripple effects of these crimes continuing to spread through subsequent generations, who inherited both psychological wounds and determination to prevent similar abuses from occurring in democratic societies that claim to value human rights and constitutional protections. The small town that would eventually become synonymous with supernatural crisis and interdimensional warfare began its existence as nothing more remarkable than a collection of farmsteads and trading posts scattered across the rolling prairie of central Indiana. Its founding in 1847, reflecting the westward expansion that characterized American settlement patterns during the decades when ambitious families sought opportunities that established Eastern communities could no longer provide to growing populations that required fresh land and new beginnings. The name Hawkins itself honored Samuel Hawkins, a surveyor and land speculator whose vision of prosperous agricultural community attracted settlers who shared his belief that careful planning and hard work could transform wilderness into civilization that would provide security and opportunity for children whose futures might be limited by circumstances in places where all the good land had already been claimed by previous generations of pioneers who had arrived earlier and established prior rights to resources that newcomers needed to build independent lives. The courthouse square that became the heart of Hawkins' civic and commercial life reflected the democratic ideals that guided 19th century American town planning. Its central location and public accessibility symbolizing commitment to governance that served all citizens rather than privileging particular economic or social groups, while the businesses that established themselves around the square created economic ecosystem that could support diverse population without requiring anyone to travel long distances for basic necessities or important services. The churches that multiplied throughout Hawkins during its early decades represented various Protestant denominations that had followed their congregations westward from established communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, their competing theological perspectives, creating religious diversity that enriched spiritual life, while occasionally generating doctrinal disputes that required diplomatic resolution by community leaders who understood that municipal harmony depended upon tolerance and mutual respect among people, whose beliefs might differ on specific points while sharing fundamental commitments to moral behavior and social responsibility. The school system that developed to serve Hawkins' growing population of families with children reflected pioneer understanding that education provided essential foundation for Republican government and economic prosperity. The one-room schoolhouses that dotted rural areas, eventually giving way to more substantial buildings in town, where larger numbers of students could receive instruction that prepared them for citizenship responsibilities and occupational opportunities that required literacy and mathematical skills that previous generations had often been forced to acquire through informal apprenticeships or self-directed study. The agricultural prosperity that sustained Hawkins through its first century of existence created stable economic foundation that attracted additional settlers while providing resources necessary for infrastructure development that connected the community to regional and national markets. The railroad that arrived in 1872, transforming local economy by enabling farmers to ship grain and livestock to distant cities, while bringing manufactured goods and new ideas that expanded possibilities for local businesses and cultural institutions. The families who established themselves as pillars of Hawkins' society during these formative decades included merchants and professionals whose success depended upon community prosperity and social stability. Their investment in local institutions like banks and newspapers and cultural organizations reflecting enlightened self-interest that recognized individual advancement as inseparable from collective welfare that required ongoing attention to education and civic improvement that benefited everyone, regardless of economic status or social background. The main street that served as commercial center for Hawkins and surrounding agricultural areas developed distinctive character that reflected both practical necessities and aesthetic aspirations of people who understood that attractive public spaces contributed to community pride and economic vitality. The storefronts and sidewalks and street lighting that evolved over successive decades, creating an environment where shopping and social interaction could occur in settings that honored human dignity while promoting commercial exchange that sustained local prosperity. The library that opened in 1903 represented community commitment to intellectual development and cultural enrichment that extended beyond basic literacy to encompass appreciation for literature and science and history that could broaden residents' understanding of world beyond their immediate experience. The reading rooms and public lectures and book clubs that emerged around this institution, creating opportunities for lifelong learning that enhanced quality of life while preparing citizens for informed participation in democratic processes. The hospital that was established in 1921 reflected growing understanding that public health required professional medical care and modern facilities that could serve entire region rather than relying solely upon individual physicians who might lack resources necessary to handle serious illnesses or traumatic injuries. The nurses' training program that accompanied this facility, creating career opportunities for young women while ensuring adequate staffing for medical services that improved survival rates and quality of life for entire population. The high school that was constructed during the 1930s represented community investment in preparing young people for opportunities that required more advanced education than elementary schools could provide. Its science laboratories and library and auditorium, creating an environment where students could explore interests and develop talents that might lead to college education or professional careers that would allow them to contribute to community development while achieving personal fulfillment through meaningful work. The businesses that flourished along Main Street during the decades preceding World War II reflected economic diversity that protected Hawkins from complete dependence upon agricultural production. The hardware stores and clothing shops and restaurants and service establishments creating employment opportunities for residents whose interests or circumstances made farming unsuitable while providing goods and services that enhanced quality of life for everyone who lived in town or surrounding rural areas. The social organizations that emerged to serve various interests and needs within the community created networks of mutual support and shared activity that strengthened bonds among residents while providing structured opportunities for day, civic engagement, and cultural expression. The volunteer fire department and women's clubs and fraternal organizations and youth groups offering ways for people to contribute to collective welfare while developing leadership skills and personal relationships that enriched their lives. The newspaper that chronicled community events and celebrated local achievements created shared narrative that helped residents understand their place in larger story of American development while maintaining connection to democratic traditions that required informed citizenry capable of making wise decisions about public policies and elected officials. The weekly editions that documented births and deaths and business openings and school events, creating permanent record of ordinary life that gained significance through careful preservation and thoughtful presentation. The seasonal festivals and holiday celebrations that brought together families and neighbors, created traditions that strengthened community identity while providing opportunities for joy and fellowship that transcended economic differences and social divisions. The parades and picnics and concerts and sporting events that marked important occasions in community calendar, demonstrating shared values and mutual affection that sustained residents through difficult periods and enhanced their appreciation of good times. The churches that continued to multiply and prosper throughout Hawkins' development reflected religious vitality that expressed itself through charitable activities and social programs that addressed needs of less fortunate community members while creating spiritual resources that helped people cope with personal tragedies and life transitions that required support systems extending beyond immediate family relationships. The Sunday services and weekday activities that filled church calendars, providing structure and meaning that enhanced individual lives while strengthening social fabric. The cemetery that expanded along with the community created peaceful setting where residents could honor deceased family members and friends while contemplating continuity of human experience that connected past generations with present inhabitants and future citizens who would inherit town that had been built through accumulated efforts of people who had chosen to invest their lives in creating something lasting and worthwhile for children and grandchildren, whose opportunities would be shaped by decisions made by earlier generations. The parks and recreational facilities that were developed during the 20th century reflected community understanding that quality of life required opportunities for leisure and physical activity that promoted health and happiness while providing gathering places where residents could interact informally and children could play safely. The baseball diamonds and tennis courts and playground equipment and picnic areas creating spaces where community bonds could be strengthened through shared enjoyment of outdoor activities that celebrated both individual achievement and collective participation. The municipal government that evolved to address increasingly complex needs of growing population demonstrated democratic principles in action through elected officials who balanced competing interests while maintaining focus on common good that required compromise and cooperation among people, whose priorities might differ, but whose commitment to community welfare created foundation for effective governance that served all residents fairly, regardless of political affiliations or personal relationships with those in positions of authority. The police and fire protection that developed to ensure public safety reflected community recognition that growth and prosperity required professional services that could respond effectively to emergencies, while maintaining order allowed businesses and families to flourish without fear of crime or disaster. The trained personnel and modern equipment that supported these services, creating security that enabled residents to pursue their goals and dreams without constant worry about threats that might disrupt their plans or endanger their well-being. The traditions that accumulated over generations of community life created cultural heritage that connected contemporary residents to founding values and aspirations, while adapting to changing circumstances that required flexibility and innovation without abandoning principles that had guided successful development through previous challenges. The stories and customs and institutional practices that defined Hawkins' identity, providing stability and continuity that helped people navigate uncertainties of modern life, while maintaining connection to sources of meaning and purpose that transcended immediate concerns. The resilience that would prove essential when supernatural forces threatened to destroy everything that generations of residents had built together was rooted in this deep foundation of mutual support and shared commitment to values that prioritized human dignity and collective welfare over individual advantage or temporary convenience. the networks of relationship and institutional resources that had been developed through decades of patient work, creating strength that could withstand tests that no previous generation could have imagined or prepared for through conventional planning and preparation. And so we close this gentle exploration of the lives that would intertwine in extraordinary ways, each backstory a thread in the tapestry that would become Hawkins' greatest story of love conquering darkness. From Victor Creel's lost dreams to Eleven's stolen childhood, from Joyce's fierce motherhood to Hopper's journey through grief toward healing, we see how ordinary people carried within themselves the seeds of extraordinary heroism. These quiet beginnings, filled with both joy and sorrow, shaped the hearts that would refuse to surrender when faced with impossible odds. In the basement where friends gathered, in the lab where children suffered, in the homes where love persevered despite hardship, the foundation was laid for the bonds that would save the world. Rest now in the knowledge that every hero's journey begins with simple human experiences: the laughter of friends, the protection of family, the courage to be authentic in a world that demands conformity. Let these origin stories remind you that greatness often grows from the smallest moments of connection and care. Sweet dreams from Hawkins, where every ending is truly a beginning in disguise.